Victorian respectability is often mistaken for a charming era of lace collars, polished shoes and politely whispered good mornings. But peel back the wallpaper, carefully, because someone will judge you for it, and you discover that respectability wasn't fashion or preference. It was survival strategy, a daily performance with the stakes of a high-wire act and the comfort of a corset 2 sizes too small. In the Victorian world, you didn't present yourself as respectable because you wanted to. You did it because the alternative was economic exile, social suspicion, and the kind of downfall that made the neighbours whisper for the next 20 years. Respectability was not optional. It was economic armour, your protective shell in a society that poked at you constantly to see if you cracked. Hello, travellers. Before we step into a Victorian world governed by appearances and quiet judgment, take a moment to like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time of day you're hearing the story unfold. Now let's begin. To understand why respectability mattered so much, you need to picture a society where safety nets simply didn't exist. Lose your job? Tough. There's no unemployment office, no assistance program. No, take a mental health week and come back stronger. If you stumbled, the system expected you to fall, and it usually helped push. What caught you wasn't support, but reputation. A respectable person was seen as employable, trustworthy, stable, and unlikely to embarrass the company, the family, or the entire kingdom. An unrespectable person. Well, they might as well tattoo "do not hire" on their forehead. In a world where industries expanded and collapsed at frightening speeds, your image was your resume, references and credit score rolled into one fragile package. And let's be clear, respectability wasn't about who you were, but who people thought you were. Employers didn't care if you were kind, hard-working, or capable. They cared if you looked like the sort of person who would be. A good reputation opened doors that skill alone never could. A bad one, it swapped those doors for brick walls. For many Victorians, the path to stability required maintaining a spotless exterior, even if your life behind the curtains resembled a chaotic opera where everyone is slightly hungry, always stressed, and constantly pretending they aren't. Marriage, for example, was a respectability minefield. It wasn't a romantic adventure. It was a financial negotiation disguised as a sentimental ceremony. A respectable match meant survival for entire families. If your character came under suspicion, too loud, too friendly, too emotional, too anything, you could lose potential partners faster than a Victorian fainting in summer heat. On the other hand, marry someone with a questionable reputation, and suddenly you became questionable too. Respectability was transmissible, like a polite, socially acceptable disease. Housing was no different. Landlords viewed tenants not as people, but as moral experiments waiting to fail. You needed to prove that you were steady, clean, punctual with rent, and, most importantly, unlikely to bring shame to the neighbourhood. A single questionable rumour could get your application rejected. Even worse, if your existing landlord heard something concerning, you might be invited to leave. Politely, of course, because even eviction had to maintain a sense of Victorian decorum. Social mobility, the dream of climbing the ladder one rung at a time, depended entirely on your ability to perform respectability with Olympic precision. You didn't need wealth to be respectable, but you needed to imitate the signs of it: ironed clothing, orderly habits, calm demeanour, and absolute control over your public behaviour. One slip, one poorly timed laugh, one appearance at the wrong event, and you could slide down the social ladder with the speed of a child on a snowy hillside. And unlike the child, nobody thought it was cute. This pressure meant that every day was a test. Eating in public? Careful. Someone may decide that the way you hold your fork reflects the purity of your soul. Crossing the street? Walk gently. Too hurried and you look desperate. Too slow and you look lazy. Even your posture declared your social worth. Slouching was not just bad manners, it was moral collapse in physical form. A Victorian mother could look at her child's drooping shoulders and see the early signs of societal ruin, like watching a building sink before the foundations give way. Respectability even dictated who you could speak to. Associating with people considered rough, immoral, or suspicious could smear your own reputation by proximity. If someone unrespectable greeted you cheerfully in public, you had two choices: politely acknowledge them and risk contamination, or pretend you suddenly went blind. Many people chose blindness. It was the safer disability. The astonishing part is how normal all of this felt to Victorians. They didn't wake up every morning thinking, "Time to armour myself in a rigid moral facade so I can survive the economy and avoid scandal." No, they simply lived in a world where appearance equaled security. Respectability kept you fed, sheltered, employed, married, and safe from the merciless Victorian grapevine. It was the invisible currency that could buy opportunity or ruin you faster than overdue rent. The irony, of course, is that many Victorians understood the absurdity of this system. They joked about it in private, they broke the rules in secret, and they whispered stories of people who lived double lives with spectacular confidence. But when morning came, the armour went back on. Respectability didn't just shape their lives, it controlled them with gentle pressure and the constant threat of being noticed. In the Victorian world, you didn't survive because you were good. You survived because you looked good enough for society to leave you alone. In the Victorian era, everything took time. Letters crossed oceans in weeks. Coal-powered trains chugged across the countryside at the thrilling speed of moderately brisk, and portraits required you to freeze your face for so long that smiling became medically inadvisable. Yet somehow, despite the leisurely pace of technology, gossip moved with the velocity of a modern scandal on social media. Before telegraphs became common, before mass newspapers reached every doorstep, and long before your aunt could message the entire family group chat, Victorian people relied on the original information superhighway, the human mouth. And unlike the trains of the time, this system never broke down, never needed coal, and never took holidays. Victorian reputation didn't just travel, it outran you, often reaching your destination a full day ahead to greet the locals with detailed opinions about your character. You could step off a train into a town you'd never visited and feel the unsettling awareness that half the community already knew whether you were well regarded, questionable, or a bit too fond of card games. Reputation was a shadow version of yourself, one you could never fully control, but which everyone else treated as your more reliable twin. This happened because Victorian society was built on tight social networks. People lived close together, shared walls, shared water pumps, shared everything except personal boundaries. A dropped comment at breakfast could become afternoon entertainment for the neighbourhood, an evening discussion for the church group. Information didn't just spread, it wove itself into the daily rhythm of life. Gossip was not simply recreation, it was a civic duty. The Victorians believed that discussing the behaviour of others helped maintain social order, much like a neighbourhood watch but with less walking and more tea. A critical factor in the speed of gossip was the sheer number of places where people gathered in close proximity. Markets, mills, laundries, boarding houses, churches, tailors, public baths, train platforms. Every one of these places was a Wi-Fi hotspot for human chatter. Workers shared rumours during breaks. Servants exchanged whispers over laundry lines. Middle-class families absorbed news from tradespeople who seemed to know everything about everyone, despite technically being hired only to fix a chair leg. Even the poorest neighbourhoods, crowded and chaotic, had bustling networks of watchful eyes, ready to broadcast the latest scandal like a human megaphone. The upper classes were no safer from reputational speed. In fact, their lives were monitored even more intensely. Aristocratic households buzzed with maids, footmen, cooks, and coachmen, not to mention all the workers who moved in and out delivering goods. Servants observed everything, and while many were discreet, plenty recognized gossip as valuable currency. A footman could trade a particular juicy detail about his employer's cousin for better treatment, or to settle a score. Meanwhile, high society itself had a weakness for tea-fueled whispers disguised as concerned observation. A duchess might speak volumes with a single raised eyebrow, and that eyebrow could ruin someone's marriage prospects by the following weekend. The result was a world where privacy barely existed. Even ordinary interactions could be misinterpreted and magnified. Say you lingered too long talking to someone at the market. Suspicious. Hid your face against the wind. Hiding something. Walked briskly. In a hurry. For what exactly? Walked slowly. A sign of moral decay. It didn't matter what you did. It mattered what someone else could imagine you were doing. And Victorians had vivid imaginations, especially when the topic involved potential disgrace. Worse still, reputation almost never travelled alone. It accumulated embellishments as it passed from person to person. A simple fact, she was out after dark, could inflate like a hot air balloon. By the time it reached the other end of town, it could become, she sneaks around at night, or she was seen with a man, or even, she's up to something unrespectable involving boots. The less specific the rumour, the more damaging it tended to be, because Victorians were experts at filling in gaps with the worst possible interpretations. This was a world that adored moral mystery but hated moral ambiguity. The dangerous part was that reputation determined access. A favourable reputation opened doors, employment, social invitations, marriage prospects, business credit, friendly neighbours. A tarnished one barricaded those doors and nailed warning signs to them. One rumour, just one, could undo years of careful presentation. You didn't need to do anything scandalous. All you needed was someone who thought you might have done something, or who misheard something, or who simply enjoyed dramatics. In short, the Victorian version of going viral was not a triumph. It was a slow-motion catastrophe. But gossip also served a more complex purpose. It was a method of regulating behaviour. People knew they were being observed, and that knowledge shaped their actions. The threat of reputational damage kept communities in line without the need for constant policing. It created a kind of social self-surveillance system, one enforced by judgmental neighbours, eager relatives, and the ever-watchful domestic staff. Respectability depended not on laws but on whispers, nods, and disapproving glances. In a strange way, gossip became the glue that held Victorian society together, even as it shredded individuals. The most astonishing part. Many Victorians participated willingly. Gossiping offered entertainment in a world with limited options. It provided connection, moral reassurance, and a sense of influence. The person who controlled a rumour held temporary power, soft, fleeting, but intoxicating. And so the system continued, fueled by curiosity, boredom, and the subtle thrill of shaping someone else's fate. In the Victorian era, your reputation didn't walk, it sprinted. And if you weren't careful, it could ruin your arrival before you even unpacked your bags. To understand the Victorian mind, you must embrace a simple truth. The world was a stage, and every person was both actor and critic, delivering a lifelong performance in the grand theatre of morality. It wasn't enough to be good. In fact, being good was often optional. What truly mattered was looking good, polished, composed, controlled, and impeccably moral. If your outward appearance suggested a life of spotless virtue, Victorians would politely avoid asking questions about what lurked behind the curtains. This was the era that perfected the art of public innocence with private contradiction. Victorian logic in a sentence. Sin quietly and dress loudly. The obsession with appearance stemmed from a culture that saw morality as something visible, almost decorative. If your clothes were neat, your posture upright, and your manners painfully precise, society assumed your soul must be similarly organised. The outward self acted as a certificate of inner virtue. This belief created an environment where optics trumped sincerity, and people put more energy into maintaining a respectable facade than into practicing the virtues that facades supposedly represented. This wasn't merely personal vanity, it was social strategy. Victorians lived in constant awareness of being observed, evaluated, and silently ranked by everyone around them. A single moment of visible impropriety, a too loud laugh, a slightly rumpled coat, a facial expression that hinted at actual emotion, could undermine years of careful moral advertising. To prevent such disasters, people developed an almost athletic dedication to self-presentation. They ironed their clothing with determination, starched their collars to battlefield stiffness, and arranged their faces into expressions that conveyed the appropriate mixture of seriousness and modest cheer. This wasn't just about clothing, though clothing certainly played a starring role. Everything from how you stood to how you glanced at others sent messages. A person's walk could broadcast composure or suggest moral looseness. A woman holding her gloves improperly might raise suspicion about her judgment. Even the way one opened a door or accepted a cup of tea signalled refinement, or the tragic lack of it. The smallest gestures were loaded with meaning, and mastering them was a lifelong project. But here's the twist. While Victorians clung to these visual symbols of virtue, private reality often operated under entirely different rules. A man could donate piously to charity in the morning and indulge in less respectable hobbies by evening. A woman could maintain the appearance of perfect domestic tranquility while hiding financial struggles, marital distress, or personal ambition. Couples presented themselves as paragons of harmony even if they barely spoke at home. The key was that none of this internal chaos spilled into public view. As long as the exterior remained polished, society was content to pretend the interior matched. Religious influence strengthened this divide between appearance and reality. Many Victorians believed that outward composure reflected inner discipline. A tidy home suggested moral order. A calm tone showed spiritual stability. By extension, anything disordered, an untidy patch of clothing, a loud gesture, a spontaneous laugh, was read as a sign of deeper moral instability. People weren't just managing their reputations, they were curating their entire existence to match societal expectations of purity and restraint. Of course, this system created odd incentives. Charity, for example, wasn't simply an act of generosity. It was a chance to be seen being generous. A person might donate to the poor not because they wished to help, but because the spectacle of kindness polished their reputation like a brass candlestick. Households competed over who could host the most respectable gatherings, not necessarily the most enjoyable ones. Even mourning became an elaborate performance, with carefully timed expressions of grief, prescribed wardrobe changes, and rules about how long sadness should be visible. This obsession with performing morality created a unique tension. Victorians were terrified of appearing flawed, but quietly accepted that everyone was flawed. It was as if the entire society had signed a silent agreement. I won't expose your imperfections if you don't expose mine. Thus, a ritual of mutual pretense emerged. People concealed their struggles beneath layers of etiquette. Failure was hidden, emotion contained, and imperfections smoothed over with polite smiles and well-fitted coats. The irony is that the emphasis on appearances often made genuine virtue hard to express. Compassion shown too openly could be labelled sentimental. Joy displayed too vividly might appear childish. Anger revealed too clearly was dangerously unrefined. People learned to simulate emotions in socially acceptable doses rather than feel them freely. Over time, the mask became the self, or at least the only self society wanted to acknowledge. In this way, appearances didn't merely conceal reality, they reshaped it. A person who spent years performing calmness learned to suppress their natural reactions. Someone who dressed elegantly every day began to believe elegance reflected actual moral worth. The facade wasn't just a costume, it became an identity, reinforced by daily practice and constant surveillance. Victorians didn't necessarily set out to deceive anyone. They simply lived in a world where public virtue was a currency and appearances were the coins. If you wanted to participate fully in society, to work, to marry, to be taken seriously, your moral display needed to shine. It didn't matter if the shine was genuine or a well-polished illusion. And so Victorian life became a masterclass in visual morality. Reality was optional, but looking respectable, that was mandatory. Victorians didn't simply wear clothes, they communicated through them. Every button, every fabric choice, every ruffle and ribbon was part of a grand, silent language in which your entire character was supposedly revealed. Clothing was never just clothing. It was morality stitched onto your body, class status woven into your sleeves, and social aspiration hemmed into the skirt you hoped wouldn't drag in the mud. If modern people have the "what your outfit says about you" videos, Victorians lived a version where your outfit didn't just talk, it tattled. Loudly, usually incorrectly, your outfit explained your soul, badly. To understand why clothing mattered so much, imagine a world with almost no reliable way to verify someone's background. There were no ID cards, no resumes, no credit histories. People learned who you were by looking at you. If you appeared disciplined, neat, and expensive, strangers assumed your character matched. Clothing became the quickest moral cheat sheet a person could display. The rules were unspoken but universally understood. Dress above your station and you looked ambitious. Dress below it and you risk being mistaken for someone irresponsible or morally questionable. Victorian fashion was built on the belief that virtue and self-control were visibly expressed through how tightly someone laced themselves into their garments. For women, corsets weren't merely fashion, they were moral architecture. A cinched waist represented restraint, discipline, and delicately curated femininity. It whispered, "This woman is refined," while simultaneously shouting, "Also, she cannot breathe." Men had their own version in stiff collars, waistcoats and coats, so structured they could probably stand upright on their own. A gentleman's clothing did not drape casually. It insisted on order. Colours played a role in signalling character as well. Bright hues were acceptable for children and the very wealthy, those who could afford to look like expensive parakeets. For everyone else, modest shades like black, navy and brown conveyed seriousness and reliability. A respectable person's wardrobe was a muted palette, reflecting an equally muted emotional display. If your clothing shouted, you clearly lacked self-restraint. If it whispered, society felt reassured, and fabric mattered deeply. Cotton was fine. Wool was ideal. Linen was acceptable in moderation. But silk was suspicious, too shiny, too extravagant, too expressive of comfort and luxury, things Victorians felt should be enjoyed cautiously, preferably in the privacy of a room with the curtains closed. Poorer families often saved for years to afford one respectable outfit, because they knew a single appearance in shabby clothing could erode their social credibility. Respectability was expensive, and many households lived on the edge of ruin just to look like they weren't. But clothing didn't only express virtue, it communicated class with ruthless precision. The middle class, desperate to distance themselves from the working poor, adopted fashions that required time, patience, and help to put on. Crinolines, bustles, layered skirts, detachable cuffs, and impossible collars signalled that the wearer did not perform manual labour. A woman whose skirt could knock over a tea table just by turning around was clearly someone who didn't scrub her own floors. A man whose polished boots had never met a muddy field advertised himself as respectable without saying a word. Accessories could make or break the entire performance. Gloves were indispensable, not because they were practical, but because they hid your hands from scrutiny. Rough or bare hands hinted at work, real work, which immediately lowered your perceived refinement. Hats performed similar magical feats. A proper hat made you appear finished, as if your morality were tied to headwear. The wrong hat, on the other hand, could raise deep philosophical questions about your upbringing. Victorians believed so strongly in clothing as moral language that they created outrageously detailed etiquette rules about when and how certain garments should be worn. Morning dresses were different from afternoon dresses, which were different from promenade dresses, which were absolutely not to be confused with evening gowns. Each outfit had a designated time slot, like a moral appointment calendar covering your entire day. If you appeared in the wrong attire at the wrong time, it suggested disorganisation, which, in Victorian thinking, slid quickly into deeper moral failings. The paradox was that clothing both united and divided people. It gave the aspiring classes a path to perform respectability, allowing someone with little wealth to present themselves as worthy of opportunity. But it also reinforced the barriers between social groups. A working-class woman could be impeccably neat and morally upright, but if her clothing betrayed her poverty, many Victorians would dismiss her character before she even spoke. Yet for all its rigidity, the Victorian dress code wasn't merely oppressive, it was also imaginative. People used clothing to create alternate versions of themselves. A shop clerk could transform into a picture of refinement on Sundays. A woman working as a governess could mimic the style of the household she served, hoping it might improve her chances of marriage or a better position. Clothing offered a rare chance to rewrite one's story, even if the narrative was more hopeful fiction than fact. In the end, Victorian clothing was less about fashion than signalling. It told others how to treat you, where to place you, and whether to trust you. Did the signals reflect reality? Rarely. But they shaped Victorian life with such intensity that people stopped asking whether clothes made the man. In this era, clothes were the man and woman and child, an entire household. Victorians lived in a world where actual sanitation was questionable at best, yet cleanliness, or rather, the appearance of it, became a crucial moral statement. It didn't matter if your drinking water contained half the local ecosystem, or if the neighbourhood smelled like it had been marinated in industrial fumes. What mattered was that you personally appeared fresh, neat, disciplined, and scrubbed into social acceptability. Hygiene may not have killed germs, because many Victorians still didn't know germs existed, but it definitely killed reputations. Dirt wasn't dangerous, being seen as dirty was. The paradox of Victorian cleanliness begins with the simple fact that actual washing was often difficult, inconvenient, or downright hazardous. Indoor plumbing was a luxury. Hot water required labour. Bathing involved a metal tub that seemed designed less for comfort and more as a reminder that life was supposed to be mildly miserable. Many families bathed only once a week, and sometimes all used the same water, which gave family bonding a scent history conveniently forgot. And yet, despite these limitations, society expected everyone to look as though they had just been polished by angels. Why? Because Victorians believed cleanliness wasn't just physical, it was moral. The idea that cleanliness is next to godliness didn't come from medical reasoning but from moral philosophy and religious rhetoric. A clean exterior suggested purity, self-control and discipline. A dirty exterior implied carelessness, moral weakness, or the dreaded condition of being unrespectable. Even children, who by nature excel at turning cleanliness into chaos, were judged harshly. A grubby child was not a child at play. It was a warning sign that the family lacked proper values. Neatness became a visible code of self-mastery. If you could keep yourself clean despite all environmental obstacles, you were clearly a person of strong character. If you couldn't, people assumed your internal world was as untidy as your hems. This created a strange divide in Victorian logic where a person could live next to an open sewage ditch yet still be labelled dirty if their boots weren't polished. The obsession extended beyond bodies to clothing, hair, and even the tools of grooming. Polished shoes meant stability. Clean fingernails indicated restraint. Well-brushed hair meant refinement. Dirt beneath the nails whispered of physical labour. Work Victorians associated not just with poverty, but with moral looseness. Essentially, being clean proved you weren't overly entangled with the messy realities of survival. The irony, of course, was that many respectable people achieved their spotless appearance by avoiding actually washing. Soap was expensive, water could be unsafe, and bathing too frequently was considered suspicious, even unhealthy. Instead, Victorians perfected surface-level hygiene, a kind of cosmetic cleanliness that focused on what others could see. Powder masked odours, pomades held hair in place, and occasionally glued together entire ecosystems of lice. Clothing was brushed vigorously, even if the person wearing it had not seen a proper bath in weeks. The body might be a battlefield, but the exterior needed to look like a museum exhibit. Even homes followed this cleanliness morality link. Floors might be swept daily while chamber pots were emptied irregularly. Middle-class households displayed immaculate drawing rooms that no one actually lived in. Carefully arranged spaces intended to project respectability to visitors. These rooms were domestic illusions, places where spotless surfaces insisted that chaos never existed anywhere inside the home. Forget germs. Victorians were fighting moral infection. The cultural messaging around cleanliness became so strong that even those without resources were judged by the same impossible standards. Poor families living in overcrowded, unsanitary neighbourhoods faced harsh moral scrutiny. Inspectors, landlords, and charitable visitors evaluated them not by their circumstances but by their tidiness. A working mother who returned home exhausted and covered in factory dust might be labelled negligent simply because she lacked time to polish her children into visual respectability. This moralisation of cleanliness created a hierarchy where wealth, access to clean water, and personal virtue became entangled. The affluent, who could afford servants, bath water, and multiple outfits, were conveniently able to maintain the illusion of perpetual purity. The working poor, whose lives required physical labour, were frequently accused of lacking self-control. Cleanliness became a social marker that rewarded privilege while disguising it as moral excellence. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Victorian cleanliness culture was its performative nature. People washed strategically, before going out, before church, before work, and especially before encounters where reputational judgment was likely. The purpose of cleanliness wasn't comfort or health, it was visibility. It existed for public consumption, a shield against scrutiny and suspicion. The real measure of purity was not how clean you were, but how clean you appeared. And despite the absurdity, the system worked. For a while. Neatness created a sense of order in a rapidly industrializing world. Personal grooming offered a small area of control when everything else felt uncertain. Cleanliness provided psychological reassurance, even if it didn't provide medical protection. And as with so many Victorian practices, the habit became self-perpetuating. People kept cleaning because everyone else kept watching. By the end of the era, when germ theory finally gained ground, Victorians discovered that cleanliness had real health benefits. But for most of the century, hygiene was moral theatre, a ritual of self-polishing performed with strict devotion. The goal wasn't to avoid illness, it was to avoid judgment. In Victorian society, dirt could be forgiven, but looking dirty, that was a sin no amount of scrubbing could wash away. Victorian homes were not merely places to sleep, eat, and store the children until they could be dressed properly. They were performances in wood, wallpaper, and obsessive dusting, elaborate stage sets designed to communicate the moral excellence of the family living inside. A home didn't just shelter you, it testified on your behalf. Anyone stepping through the front door wasn't simply visiting, they were inspecting, judging, silently scoring your existence the way one might evaluate a fruitcake for structural integrity. And so the Victorian home evolved into a carefully curated moral exhibit, where even the furniture seemed aware it was being watched. To understand this transformation, imagine a world where the home represented the inner soul of the household. Public life was for employment and obligation. The home was where virtue supposedly flourished. But that virtue didn't flourish naturally. It was arranged, polished, embroidered, framed, and placed exactly 3 inches from the vase for optimal respectability. The drawing room in particular, the holy shrine of middle-class aspiration, was crafted with such precision that many families barely used it. Some homes kept the curtains drawn except during visits, as if exposing the room to sunlight might wear down its moral fibres. Furniture played a starring role in this domestic theatre. Chairs were arranged in symmetrical formations that screamed orderliness. Tables stood at polite distances from each other, like guests at a party determined not to mingle. Upholstery came in patterns so rigid that the slightest wrinkle felt like a personal failure. Sofas, though cushioned, were not designed for lounging. They were designed for being viewed, preferably while unsat upon. You could sit on them, of course, but only if you did so with the posture of someone auditioning for the role of perfectly upright citizen. Reclining was social heresy. Every surface demanded discipline. Mantelpieces displayed a strategic lineup of objects whose sole purpose was to present refinement. Porcelain figurines, wax flowers, framed samplers, seashells arranged by someone who had never set foot on a beach. Nothing was random, nothing was accidental. Everything had meaning, or at least pretended to. Even the placement of books signalled character. Religious volumes front and centre, improving literature nearby. Anything mildly entertaining was hid discreetly, like contraband joy. The organisation of space also followed strict moral geography. The front rooms, visible to guests, were spotless and formal, monuments to the family's public image. The back rooms, the kitchen, scullery, and cramped servants' quarters held chaos, noise, and the real work of keeping the façade functioning. Many Victorian homes functioned like theatrical productions, polished front of house, frantic backstage. The irony was that the parts of the home most essential to survival were the ones most aggressively hidden. Respectability demanded that labour remain invisible, as if food materialised on the table through divine intervention, rather than a sweat-drenched maid elbow-deep in potatoes. The obsession extended to the arrangement of daily life. Households maintained strict routines designed not just for efficiency, but for optics. Curtains had to be opened at the right hour to signal industriousness. Fires lit at the appropriate time to convey comfortable stability. Floors polished regularly to prove diligence. Even the act of dusting became ritualistic, because dust was not simply dirt. It was a sign of moral decline, a symbol of losing control of one's surroundings. A speck of dust on a bookshelf whispered, "This family is slipping," louder than any spoken accusation. Victorian domestic order also served as a training ground for displaying emotional discipline. The home's appearance was expected to mimic the family's internal state: calm, structured, modestly pleasant, and decidedly not prone to outbursts. Furniture remained where it was put. Decoration stayed symmetrical. Objects sat exactly where they belonged. This stillness suggested a household where feelings were similarly contained, tidy, predictable, and arranged for comfort. A wildly disorganized home implied wildly disorganized spirits, and Victorian society did not take kindly to either. Even children were incorporated into the staged domestic tableau. They were posed like decorative additions, expected to appear clean, quiet, and charming. Three qualities children famously possess only when asleep or bribed heavily with biscuits. Their toys were to be stored immediately after use, their noise controlled, their presence showcased as proof of domestic harmony, so long as they didn't behave like actual children in front of guests. Visitors, of course, played their part in this drama. Calling rituals were elaborate exchanges in which people toured each other's staged rooms, commenting politely on curtains and table arrangements, as if evaluating a competitor's entry in a domestic morality contest. A home that looked well kept signalled a family that was stable, respectable, and socially safe to associate with. A home that appeared disorderly, even slightly, bred suspicion. If the sofa cushion was crooked, who knew what deeper chaos lurked? Disorder in decor hinted at disorder in life, and disorder in life threatened everyone's social peace. The funny thing is that many Victorians understood how artificial the whole system was. They joked privately about the pressures of maintaining a flawless home. They sighed over the endless cleaning, the stiff furniture they couldn't comfortably sit on, the hours spent rehearsing civility within walls that demanded it. Yet the performance continued because the home was more than a living space. It was a social promise, a visible pledge that the inhabitants were trustworthy, moral, and worthy of respect. In the Victorian world, your home didn't just reflect your life. It performed it, beautifully, rigidly, and under constant inspection. Even the furniture knew better than to relax. To the Victorians, silence wasn't awkward. It was virtue in audio form. The era prized quietness with a devotion that bordered on athletic discipline. Speaking freely, expressing emotions openly, or acknowledging certain bodily realities wasn't merely discouraged. It was considered an alarming breach of civility. True refinement meant managing one's internal storms so gracefully that they never rustled the lace curtains. In a society obsessed with appearances, silence became the final polish on the respectable persona. No sound, no problem. The Victorian relationship with silence didn't arise from a natural quietness. Quite the opposite. The world they lived in was loud. Cities clattered with industry. Streets clanged with carts, footsteps, and horses who refused to consider noise regulations. Households bustled with servants working, children practicing instruments poorly, fires crackling, and furniture complaining under the weight of decorative clutter. Yet despite the surrounding noise, people were expected to project a personal hush, an aura of tranquil self-restraint. The ideal Victorian was calm, measured, and so internally controlled that nothing about them risked attracting auditory attention. This expectation shaped social behaviour from the earliest age. Children were taught seen but not heard long before they could pronounce the words. Speaking too loudly marked you as unruly. Asking too many questions hinted at intellectual over-eagerness, a danger to the carefully curated atmosphere of polite mystery. Crying was discouraged, laughing too hard was indecent, and showing enthusiasm was a slippery slope towards social chaos. In short, emotions were to be stored neatly inside the body, like winter linens packed away in a trunk. Silence around bodily functions was practically a religion. The Victorians possessed a remarkable vocabulary, designed solely to avoid mentioning anything the human body does naturally. Entire social dances revolved around pretending the digestive system did not exist. A guest who needed the privy did not announce it. They simply vanished for a moment and returned without comment, leaving everyone to maintain the fiction that they had stepped outside to commune with the gardenias. Noise? Absolutely forbidden. A bodily sound could end friendships, derail courtships, and, legend has it, bring polite society to a complete halt while everyone pretended nothing had happened. Silence also extended to personal problems. Victorians mastered the art of suffering quietly, tucking away their pains and anxieties beneath layers of etiquette. Physical discomfort, endure it politely. Emotional distress, smile through it. Financial trouble, whisper only to your spouse if at all. To admit hardship publicly was to disrupt the delicate surface of propriety that everyone else was working so hard to maintain. Even illness had to be managed with tasteful restraint. Being bedridden was acceptable. Describing your symptoms was not. A lady could be indisposed, a gentleman under the weather, but neither should explain what parts of the body were involved, lest the fainting couches grow overburdened. This widespread silence wasn't accidental. It was a form of social protection. In a world where reputation was fragile and appearances mattered more than reality, speaking openly about personal struggles risked exposing vulnerabilities that others might judge or exploit. Silence served as a shield, a way to keep the socially dangerous parts of life neatly hidden. It prevented gossip, preserved dignity, and allowed everyone to pretend that life was smoother, calmer, and more manageable than it actually was. But silence wasn't just defensive, it was also aspirational. A quiet demeanour suggested inner discipline, emotional regulation, and moral steadiness. To remain composed in conversation, offering only gentle comments or measured responses, was to demonstrate mastery over oneself. Victorians valued this composure so deeply that they built entire conversational customs around it. Small talk became an art form precisely because it avoided depth. Discussing the weather signalled social intelligence. It was safe, neutral, and blissfully quiet in implication. Social gatherings followed a choreography of politeness, where conversation was expected to flow like gentle water, without splashes, ripples, or unexpected currents. Loud opinions were frowned upon, arguments were unthinkable, excitement was suspicious. The quiet person, controlled and unflappable, was admired. The talkative person, capable of filling the room with ideas, risks, and originality, was treated the way one might treat a horse that bolts unexpectedly, beautiful, but in need of calming. The irony is that Victorians did communicate intensely, but through subtext, hints, sidelong glances, and polite euphemisms that conveyed meaning without disturbing the soundscape. A raised eyebrow could speak an entire sentence. A pause could communicate disapproval. A subtle shift in posture might reveal more than actual words ever could. Silence became its own language, one that required constant fluency. This quietness shaped relationships as well. Courtships were famously quiet affairs, filled with restrained conversations, chaperoned walks, and carefully measured pauses. Romantic declarations were subdued, often written rather than spoken, as if even love needed to whisper. Within marriage, many couples communicated more through routine than dialogue, their emotional lives regulated by cultural expectations that discouraged vulnerability. Yet, for all its limitations, silence offered something Victorians valued deeply: control. In a rapidly changing world, industrial chaos, scientific upheaval, political turmoil, silence provided a small island of stability, a way to hold oneself steady when everything else felt unpredictable. To be silent was to be strong, or at least to look strong, and often looking strong was more important. In the Victorian world, the mark of a refined person wasn't their ability to speak beautifully. It was their ability to say nothing beautifully. And if it made noise, well, it wasn't polite. Victorian society did not dislike emotion. Not exactly. It simply believed emotions should behave themselves. Feelings were meant to appear in small, tidy doses, like teaspoons of medicine, measured, supervised, and never strong enough to disturb anyone else's digestion. In a world obsessed with composure, the raw, unfiltered human experience was considered dangerous, messy, and inconvenient. And so the Victorians did what they did best. They regulated emotions with the same determination they used to regulate their table manners. The first rule of Victorian emotional life was simple: never overwhelm the room. Joy could be expressed, but only modestly. A smile was ideal. Laughter was a moral hazard. Excessive happiness signalled frivolity, and frivolity hinted at a weak character. Even celebration had to maintain restraint. A family might receive good news, an engagement, a promotion, a long-lost cousin returning from sea, and respond with the emotional equivalent of a gentle nod. Anything more exuberant risked looking uncontrolled, which in Victorian logic was just 2 steps away from scandal. Grief, on the other hand, was permitted, but heavily choreographed. Mourning became a structured ritual, complete with appropriate clothing, timelines, and acceptable emotional displays. A widow, for example, was expected to grieve decorously, wearing black for months or years, depending on the closeness of the relationship. But within that ritual, her actual feelings were secondary. She was meant to symbolize loss, not embody it. Crying was acceptable in private, but public displays were supposed to be soft. No dramatic sobs, no uncontrollable anguish. Even in death, decorum was the priority. Victorians were masters at turning heartbreak into quiet home decor. Anger, naturally, was the most forbidden of all feelings. Anger was noisy. It disrupted symmetry. It suggested a loss of that all-important self-control. Victorian men could show irritation in dignified flashes, preferably worded politely. Victorian women? Their anger was expected to dissolve into silence, melancholy, or a genteel withdrawal from the room. A woman who displayed anger openly risked being seen as unstable, or worse, unfeminine. Society preferred its women as emotional furniture, decorative, steady, and without sudden movements. Affection operated under similar restrictions. Parents loved their children, spouses loved one another, and friends formed deep bonds. But they were not encouraged to showcase these emotions with physical warmth or exuberant statements. Public affection between spouses was considered embarrassing at best, indecent at worst. Even within the home, affection was expressed through duty, care, and proper behaviour rather than hugs or affectionately chaotic conversation. A father showing emotion too openly risked undermining his authority. A mother being too affectionate risked appearing indulgent. Victorians believed love should guide behaviour, not spill visibly out of it. Because emotions needed containment, Victorians developed intricate strategies for managing them. Emotional outbursts were redirected into acceptable outlets, writing letters, reading poetry, taking long walks, or composing melancholic entries in journals. The world might never see the inner tempest, but the diary certainly would. The Victorians produced oceans of introspective writing, not because they were uniquely sentimental, but because paper did not judge or gossip. A journal was the only safe place where someone could be dramatically upset without frightening the wallpaper. This suppression created what we might now call emotional echoes, feelings that reverberated quietly inside people because they lacked healthy roots of expression. A person who experienced anger might become suddenly rigid in posture. Someone overwhelmed by grief might develop nervous habits. Unspoken affection might appear as excessive politeness. The body expressed what the voice was not allowed to. Victorian literature, especially the novels of the era, is filled with silent suffering, restrained passion, and characters whose deepest feelings appear only through small gestures. A hand tremor, a change in tone, a carefully timed exit. Fiction reflected reality with uncomfortable accuracy. The cultural obsession with rationing emotion also served a social function. By limiting emotional expression, Victorians avoided creating vulnerability, which could be exploited by gossip, rivals, or anyone eager to question a family's stability. Emotion was power, but uncontrolled emotion risked revealing weakness. So feelings were stored, folded, and tucked away like fine linens waiting for special occasions. This didn't mean Victorians lacked intense emotional lives. They felt deeply. They simply believed society functioned best when those depths remained hidden. There were, however, fascinating exceptions to this emotional restraint, moments where society allowed emotion to erupt safely. Theatre was one such outlet. Audiences wept freely during tragedies, gasped dramatically at plot twists, and displayed passionate reactions that would have been unacceptable in daily life. Music halls, too, provided a sanctioned space for laughter and energy. These environments offered temporary relief from the pressure to maintain composure. For a few hours, one could be emotionally alive without violating decorum. But once the performance ended, the rules returned. The emotional levers were switched back to mild, and everyone resumed their roles as models of quiet self-containment. The Victorian worldview insisted that stability came from restraint, and restraint came from mastering one's emotional impulses until they fit neatly into social expectations. In a world where storms raged beneath calm surfaces, Victorians became experts in emotional engineering. Their feelings didn't disappear, they were simply compressed, distilled, and rationed out with immense care. Grief, joy, anger, affection, all were permitted, but only in forms that wouldn't disturb the fragile social atmosphere. Feelings were allowed, just not too many, not too loudly. and preferably where no one could see. In Victorian society, women were not merely individuals, they were public symbols, moral advertisements on legs, carrying the family's reputation the way someone today might carry a fragile heirloom they are terrified of dropping. The pressure placed upon women to embody virtue, restraint, and propriety was immense, relentless, and woven into every aspect of daily life. Men might represent power or authority, but women represented respectability. And where men's mistakes were often treated as unfortunate lapses, a woman's mistake, real or imagined, could detonate the social status of entire households. The roots of this phenomenon lay in the Victorian fixation on female moral superiority, or rather, the expectation of it. Society constructed an idealized version of womanhood, pure, modest, self-sacrificing, endlessly patient, and unfailingly well-behaved. Women were seen as the moral centers of the home, the gentle civilizing forces that kept husbands and children from sliding into chaos. In theory, this placed women on a pedestal. In practice, the pedestal was made of thin glass and placed at the edge of a cliff. Every action a woman took, how she walked, spoke, dressed, and even breathed, was scrutinized for signs of propriety. Her behavior was treated as evidence of her family's values. If she adhered to social expectations flawlessly, her household basked in the glow of her virtue. If she deviated, even slightly, suspicion spread like wildfire. A man could gamble, rant loudly in public, or make questionable business decisions and society might roll its eyes. A woman could step outside unaccompanied and risk becoming the subject of whispered autopsies of her character. Because women symbolized respectability, they were expected to maintain it constantly. Self-control became a feminine obligation. Women monitored their tone of voice, their gestures, their expressions, and even their footsteps. They moved through the world as if navigating an unpredictable audience that interpreted every detail as moral data. A woman who laughed too loudly risked being labelled frivolous. One who spoke assertively risked being called unfeminine. One who looked at a man too long risked being judged improperly forward. One who didn't look at him at all risked appearing rude. Maintaining the balance required endless calculation. Clothing, of course, bore much of this burden. Women's fashion was heavy not just in fabric but in meaning. A woman's attire had to signal modesty and decorum without appearing overly wealthy or too stylish, both of which suggested dangerous vanity. A dropped hem, a torn glove, or an accessory slightly out of season could provoke commentary about a woman's upbringing or her husband's competence. The irony was that women were expected to look beautiful, but not too beautiful, fashionable, but not too fashionable, refined, but not too assertively refined. It was a balancing act performed in corsets. Courtship magnified the stakes even further. The success of a young woman's romantic prospects depended almost entirely on her reputation. A single rumour, perhaps she was seen walking with a man unchaperoned, or she laughed too freely at a dance, could render her unmarriageable. And because marriage was often a woman's primary path to financial stability, these judgments carried life-altering consequences. Families guarded their daughters like priceless antiques, ensuring they never encountered situations where their reputational shine could be smudged. Inside marriage, the burden did not lighten. Wives were held responsible for the moral climate of the home. If a husband behaved badly, society sometimes blamed the wife for failing to regulate him properly. She was expected to maintain serenity, guide the children's upbringing, supervise the servants, manage the household budget, entertain guests, and maintain her own appearance, all without appearing overwhelmed or resentful. Any failure risked reflecting poorly on her husband's judgment, her family's values, and her upbringing. Widows faced their own unique pressures. A widow who grieved incorrectly, either too visibly or too briefly, invited comment. If she remarried too soon, she was judged heartless. If she remained single, she was pitied or suspected of enjoying her independence too much. Women were expected to embody respectable emotion, respectable resilience, respectable timing. Even their suffering had to conform to social rules. Working-class women carried the burden just as heavily, though differently. Their reputations were judged not through drawing-room performance, but through public behaviour and domestic diligence. A working woman who walked alone at night could be misjudged instantly. A mother whose children appeared unkempt faced accusations of moral failure. Even women employed in physically demanding jobs were expected to perform modesty under circumstances that made modesty nearly impossible. Still, society watched them closely, ready to interpret hardship as deficiency. Perhaps the most oppressive aspect of this system was how reputational damage radiated outward. One woman's perceived misstep could tarnish her sister's marriage prospects, her brother's professional standing, her father's reputation in the community, and her mother's social relationships. Men's reputations rested on accomplishments, women's reputations rested on behaviour, and that behaviour carried the weight of everyone else's aspirations. The astounding thing is that despite the intense pressure, many women internalised these expectations. They worked tirelessly to uphold the family's moral image, not simply because society demanded it, but because they believed it necessary for their loved one's survival. Respectability was not a personal trait. It was a shared resource women were expected to protect at all costs. Victorian society trusted women with its moral identity, but only on the condition that they never fail. One misinterpreted gesture, one poorly timed laugh, one rumour, and the pedestal shattered. And when it did, it wasn't only the woman who fell. If Victorian women were expected to embody purity and moral serenity, Victorian men were expected to embody something far more exhausting, unshakable control. A respectable man was not merely well-dressed and polite. He was a walking lighthouse of stability, beaming calm authority across the stormy waters of industrial-era life. Where women's respectability revolved around virtue, men's revolved around competence, composure, and the illusion that nothing, absolutely nothing, could unsettle them. In a world full of economic uncertainty, political upheaval, and unpredictable moustaches, Victorian men were taught to perform steadiness so convincingly that they practically became decorative pillars in their own households. The first expectation placed upon men was restraint, emotional, physical, and financial. A respected man was not supposed to show strong emotions, except perhaps mild irritation or deeply controlled pride. Joy was permitted if it looked dignified. Sadness was allowed if hidden behind a newspaper. Anger was acceptable only when distributed in calm, articulate statements, never in outbursts. And panic? Panic was forbidden. A man panicking openly risked appearing weak, unmanly, or, worst of all, unable to manage his household. The respectable Victorian gentleman therefore developed an incredibly specific stress response, imploding internally while appearing perfectly composed. This restraint extended into daily behaviour. A man didn't rush. Rushing signalled desperation. He didn't raise his voice. Loudness suggested instability. He didn't gesticulate wildly. That was for poets and people with feelings. Instead, he moved with the deliberation of a well-trained clockwork figure, offering handshake-firm greetings, carefully measured nods, and sentences so restrained they practically apologized for existing. The idea was to project mastery over oneself, over one's environment, over every unpredictable detail of life. Authority was the second pillar of male respectability. A respectable Victorian man was expected to lead calmly and effectively, whether managing a business, supervising workers, making household decisions, or presiding over family affairs. Even if he had no natural leadership ability, he had to perform it convincingly. Hesitation looked weak, doubt looked irresponsible, and heaven forbid he admit he was wrong. That could topple the entire façade. Victorian masculinity operated under the assumption that a respectable man always knew what he was doing, even if he didn't, especially if he didn't. This performance of authority was intertwined with financial control, perhaps the most defining aspect of male respectability. Men were expected to earn a steady income, manage money wisely, and support their families within a structure that offered no true safety nets. Economic failure wasn't seen as bad luck. It was interpreted as moral failure, a sign that the man lacked discipline or foresight. A gentleman who mismanaged his finances risked social humiliation and family disgrace. His economic choices weren't private, they were moral acts, evaluated harshly by peers and neighbours alike. This pressure created an environment in which men were constantly performing financial competence, even when their actual finances resembled a precarious stack of unpaid bills. Many men worked long hours, avoided risky investments, or took on multiple roles just to maintain a stable facade. They didn't discuss money troubles openly. Such admissions threatened their entire identity. Instead, they worried silently, paced discreetly, and read the financial column with the expression of someone studying ancient prophecies. Yet Victorian men were not allowed to be solely economic machines. They also had to maintain impeccable public behaviour. They were expected to be courteous without appearing soft, confident without appearing arrogant, intelligent without overshadowing others, and principled without being self-righteous. These were narrow lanes to walk, and men navigated them with the anxious precision of someone balancing a tea tray during an earthquake. One misstep, a poorly timed joke, an emotional comment, a lapse in etiquette, and the performance cracked. Workplace interactions were equally saturated with expectations. A man was to be industrious but calm, ambitious but not grasping, authoritative but not tyrannical. The Victorian office or workshop was a quiet battlefield where reputations lived and died, based on how well a man performed composure under pressure. Competence alone wasn't enough. He had to exude steadiness, reliability, and the aura of someone who could handle any crisis with the same quiet tone he used to ask for more sugar in his tea. Even leisure activities were shaped by this respectability performance. Men engaged in sports like cricket or rowing not merely for health or pleasure, but because such activities displayed discipline, endurance, and controlled physicality. A gentleman might sweat, but he did so gracefully. Working-class men bonded through communal activities like pub games, but even there, self-control was admired. Losing one's temper over a game of darts was a social sin. Losing with stoic dignity, however, was excellent masculinity. Within the home, the expectations were no less demanding. A husband had to appear firm but kind, rational but approachable, strong but gentle. His authority had to be evident but never harsh, like a velvet-covered anvil. Children were to admire him, wives to rely upon him, and guests to view him as the embodiment of respectable manhood. Whether he actually possessed these qualities mattered far less than whether he projected them convincingly. Yet beneath all this performance, men faced the same internal struggles as everyone else. They felt stress, fear, doubt, ambition, grief, but society offered them few avenues to express any of it. Where women were restricted in their behaviour, men were restricted in their vulnerability. Emotional expression was considered feminine. Therefore, respectable men buried their feelings deep enough to qualify for archaeological study. In the end, Victorian men performed respectability like a lifelong role in a play that never stopped, not even backstage. A gentleman didn't panic. He maintained his posture. He didn't cry. He tightened his jaw. He didn't crumble. He quietly imploded, politely, and without inconveniencing anyone. To the Victorians, children were not miniature chaos engines or sources of joyful noise. They were future adults in urgent need of refinement. Childhood was not celebrated for its innocence or creativity. It was treated as a lengthy apprenticeship in behaving properly. From the moment a child could wobble upright, society began training them to perform respectability with the seriousness of an understudy learning a role they were expected to play flawlessly for the rest of their lives. Play was not outlawed. but it was tucked into narrow windows, carefully supervised and stripped of anything that might encourage spontaneity. In Victorian logic, fun could wait, discipline could not. The earliest lessons came through posture, speech, and silence. Toddlers were corrected gently but constantly, as if misbehaviour were a kind of moral stain that had to be polished away before it set. A child who spoke too loudly, moved too quickly, or expressed emotion too freely was guided back into the narrow lane of proper conduct. The ideal Victorian child was calm, obedient, modest, and pleasantly invisible. In many homes, little ones were expected to speak only when spoken to, and preferably in short, grammatically correct sentences that revealed no trace of excitement. For middle and upper class children, education was one of the primary tools for moulding respectability. Lessons were not just about reading, writing, and arithmetic. They were about discipline, self-control, and moral instruction. Girls learned deportment, needlework, and the importance of modest self-presentation. Boys learned manners, restraint, and the posture of future authority. Tutors, governesses, and schoolmasters enforced routines with military precision. A slouch could earn a reprimand. An ink blot on a composition was a sign of carelessness. Children's handwriting was expected to reflect their character. Orderly letters meant an orderly mind. Even leisure was curated to teach discipline. Games requiring calmness, turn-taking, and rule-following were encouraged. Anything that produced too much noise or excitement, running wildly, shouting, laughing with abandon, was viewed as an alarming sign of insufficient moral development. Activities like reading moral stories, practicing piano scales, and memorizing poetry were considered safer ways to occupy young minds. These pursuits conveniently built skills for adulthood, while minimizing the risk of children behaving like, well, children. Victorian toys also reflected this philosophy. They were designed less for pleasure and more for instruction. Dolls taught girls maternal duty. Model soldiers taught boys patriotism and order. Educational puzzles and books reinforced intellectual discipline. Even outdoor equipment, stilts, hoops, skipping ropes, came with rules regarding proper posture and appropriate enthusiasm. The message was clear. Fun was allowed only if it supported the overarching goal of producing respectable adults. Family dynamics further reinforced the training. Parents expected obedience without question and modesty without exception. Many children were raised to see adults as beings of almost terrifying authority. A child who contradicted an adult, even politely, risked being labelled unruly. A child who dared express boredom during a long dinner was reprimanded for disrespect. A child who displayed too much curiosity about adult topics, money, illness, conflict, was told such matters were not for them. The goal was not to suppress intelligence, but to channel it into the proper, quiet avenues. Children in wealthier households lived under an additional layer of surveillance. Servants, nursery maids, governesses, and attendants monitored behaviour constantly. A child who misbehaved not only disappointed the family but embarrassed the staff, who were partially responsible for the child's moral grooming. As a result, children learned early that they were both loved and evaluated, cherished and corrected. Even playrooms, the spaces supposedly designated for childish freedom, were often kept tidy, with toys arranged according to particular systems that gave the illusion, at least, of order. Working-class children were not exempt from respectability training either, though their lessons came through labour rather than tutors. Many began working at young ages, absorbing discipline through factory whistles, apprenticeships, and household responsibilities. Respectability for working-class families meant reliability, cleanliness, and good behaviour in public spaces. Children were taught to follow rules, respect authority, and avoid drawing negative attention. While their lives were far less sheltered than those of wealthier children, the pressure to perform respectability was just as intense, perhaps even more so because any misbehaviour risked confirming society's prejudices against the poor. The rare moments when Victorian children were allowed genuine fun, holidays, public fairs, outdoor excursions, were almost shocking in contrast. Children might run, shout, or laugh freely for a few hours, only to return to normal life where these behaviours were once again considered dangerous to their moral development. The temporary freedom made the everyday restrictions feel even heavier. Interestingly, Victorian literature often revealed the emotional impact of this upbringing. Novels for children emphasised moral lessons, self-sacrifice, and quiet heroism. Naughty characters were consistently corrected or redeemed. Kind, obedient children were rewarded with tearful reunions, symbolic gifts, or at least a pleasant moral glow. Stories taught young readers that respectability was not just expected, it was the pathway to happiness, acceptance, and safety. In hindsight, Victorian childhood appears almost theatrical. Children practiced the lines and movements of respectable adulthood long before they understood why. Their lives were structured like rehearsals for roles they had not chosen but were required to perform. The idea of childhood as a time of exploration, creativity, and emotional growth would not gain traction until later centuries. For the Victorians, childhood was about preparation, and preparation was serious business. Fun was not forbidden. It was simply scheduled so carefully that spontaneity had no room to breathe. In the race to become respectable adults, childhood was less a playground and more a practice stage. Victorian society liked to pretend sexuality was a faint, distant rumour, something that happened in other eras, other countries, or perhaps among particularly misbehaved plants. Outwardly, the era projected an image of immaculate restraint, modest clothing, polite conversation, moral instruction, and an atmosphere so sanitized that even mentioning ankles was considered borderline rebellious. Yet beneath this polished surface lay a thriving, complicated, and very human world of desire. The Victorians didn't conquer sexuality. They simply hid it with the enthusiasm of people stuffing clutter into a drawer before guests arrive. To understand the Victorian relationship with sexuality, you must first understand their relationship with appearances. Public morality demanded spotless self-control. Desire, impulse, physical longing, these were treated as intruders one should politely but firmly show out through the back door. If someone asked whether Victorians had sexual feelings, the official answer was certainly not. If someone looked at their birth rates, the answer was, so that's where the babies came from. The strict public morality of the era created an environment where sexuality became an unspoken undercurrent, simultaneously present and denied. This denial didn't make desire disappear. It simply relocated it to private spaces, coded language, and entire industries operating behind the facade of propriety. In respectable households, conversations about sexuality were avoided nearly to the point of comedy. Parents didn't give the talk. They barely acknowledged reproduction. A young woman might be whisked into marriage with no understanding of what awaited her, armed only with vague warnings about duties and virtue. Husbands, likewise, were expected to approach intimacy with restraint and decorum, as if passion itself needed its shoes polished before entering the bedroom. Marital sexuality was acceptable, but only when performed discreetly, quietly, and never ever discussed in daylight. Yet for all their silence, Victorians were fascinated by sexuality. They wrote about it in diaries, joked about it in coded letters, and explored it in the privacy of bedrooms, brothels, boarding houses, and cleverly disguised shops. Urban centres saw the growth of entire underground economies, adult bookstores hidden behind respectable storefronts, discreet meeting places for clandestine romances, and neighbourhoods where nighttime shadows hinted at worlds beyond moral inspection. Brothels operated openly enough that police reports frequently documented them, yet society pretended they didn't exist. Advertisements for massage or French lessons and educational services circulated with such predictability that everyone understood the euphemisms. Respectable men often visited these establishments while maintaining impeccable public behaviour. Respectable women might know such places existed, but were expected to maintain the polite illusion that immorality thrived only in distant corners, never close to home. Desire wasn't just expressed through illicit activity, it appeared in more socially sanctioned forms too. Novels, plays, and art often contained coded sensuality. Popular fiction for women, while framed as moral literature, included emotional intensity that critics regularly accused of stirring unhealthy feelings. Even clothing, especially women's clothing, carried erotic subtext despite the layers. Corsets cinched waists into fashionable silhouettes, creating shapes that drew attention even as the garments claimed to enforce modesty. The era's fascination with tightly fitted bodices and elegantly contoured silhouettes revealed a tension between repressing desire and accidentally amplifying it. One of the most striking contradictions lay in the medical world. Victorian doctors published countless treatises on nervous conditions, female hysteria, and male excess, all thinly veiled attempts to understand sexuality without admitting they were discussing sexuality. Physicians advised treatments that range from morally panicked to unintentionally revealing: ice baths, restricted reading, exercises in self-control. Some treatments sought to suppress desire, others unintentionally intensified it. The medical profession spent decades circling around the subject while doing everything possible to avoid naming it. Meanwhile, private correspondence tells a different story. Lovers exchanged passionate letters filled with longing. Couples expressed tenderness behind closed doors that would have scandalized their peers. Diaries recorded desires, frustrations, confessions, and moments of intimacy carefully tucked between reflections on weather and daily chores. These documents reveal Victorians as deeply emotional, sensual, lust, and complex human beings, not the caricatures of icy restraint later stereotypes portray. This duality, public denial, private indulgence, created a society that lived two lives simultaneously. In public, Victorians championed purity. In private, they navigated desire with all the creativity and secrecy their culture demanded. Respectability was a performance. Sexuality was the secret script running underneath. Of course, this tension had consequences. Repression created misunderstandings, shame, and confusion. Many married couples struggled with intimacy, not because they lacked affection, but because they had been taught to view desire with suspicion. Young people entered adulthood without guidance, stumbling into relationships armed only with rumors. Society's refusal to speak openly about sexuality did not preserve innocence, it preserved ignorance. Yet in a strange way, the Victorian approach also revealed their deep awareness that desire was a powerful force. They feared it, admired it, denied it, and indulged it, all while pretending nothing was happening. The result was an era filled with contradictions, moralistic on the surface, passionate beneath, restrictive in theory, creative in practice. The Victorians did not eliminate sexuality. They simply hid it in parlours, behind curtains, under layers of fabric and inside secret drawers. And sometimes, quite often, it rattled the drawer loudly enough that everyone pretended not to hear. Victorian society had a remarkable talent for transforming misfortune into moral judgment. Poverty, instead of being understood as the natural outcome of economic upheaval, industrial hazards, or sheer bad luck, was reframed as a personal failing, a sign of laziness, lack of discipline, or some mysterious deficiency in character. Respectability functioned like a gate that only the financially stable could pass through, and anyone who couldn't cross it was treated not as someone in need of assistance, but as someone in need of correction. The Victorians inherited an old but persistent belief: a good person must naturally rise, and therefore anyone who didn't rise must not be very good. This idea, wrapped in religious rhetoric and economic theory, gave middle and upper-class citizens moral permission to view poverty as suspicious. It was easier, after all, to judge the poor than to admit the system might be flawed. As cities expanded during the Industrial Revolution, Poverty became more visible, more widespread, and more unavoidable. Tens of thousands crowded into slums where disease flourished, water ran black, and housing resembled stacked boxes with chimneys. But rather than recognize these conditions as structural failures, Victorians interpreted them as evidence of a moral collapse. If people lived in dirt, it must be because they tolerated it. If they lived 10 to a room, it must be due to carelessness. If children wandered barefoot through the streets, it must reflect parental inadequacy rather than economic impossibility. Respectability became a weapon, not of violence, but of exclusion. The poor were denied the dignity of complexity. Their struggles were assigned simplistic labels: idle, unclean, intemperate, irresponsible. And once labelled, they were presumed guilty until proven respectable. The burden of proof was immense. A poor woman might scrub her children daily and maintain a spotless room, but if her clothes were worn or a neighbour spread a rumour, her character was questioned. A labourer might work 14-hour days and still be told he lacked ambition simply because his wages couldn't lift him out of poverty. Charity, rather than acting as a balm, often reinforced these attitudes. Many charitable institutions embraced a philosophy known as moral uplift, insisting that helping the poor required reshaping their character. Aid came with conditions: attend religious lectures, demonstrate sober behaviour, provide proof of good conduct. The message was clear: help is a privilege granted to the deserving, not a right owed to the struggling. The deserving poor were tidy, grateful, mild, and neatly self-sacrificing. The undeserving poor were anyone who failed to fit the script. Workhouses embodied this philosophy with brutal clarity. These institutions, meant to provide relief, operated on the principle that conditions must be so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would enter. Families were separated, labour was endless, food was bland and insufficient, privacy was non-existent. These environments weren't designed to help people escape poverty. They were designed to discourage them from seeking help. By making relief humiliating, society could reassure itself that only the good poor would endure it. Public discourse reinforced this cruelty. Newspapers published editorials scolding the poor for moral laxity. Politicians argued that generosity bred dependence. Even literature, some of it sympathetic, couldn't escape the era's habit of treating poverty as a dramatic flaw rather than a widespread social condition. Respectability was held up as the key to improvement, though the poor were offered none of the resources required to achieve it. This moralization of poverty made upward mobility exceedingly difficult. A person might work tirelessly, but without clean clothing, formal speech patterns, or an unblemished reputation, they would struggle to secure better employment. The system demanded signs of respectability from the very people deprived of the means to display them. In essence, Victorian society asked the poor to prove they were respectable before allowing them any chance to become so. Women and children suffered the most under this ruthless logic. A poor woman seeking work risked suspicion from the start. Domestic service required spotless reputation and spotless uniforms, luxuries many could not afford. A single hint of impropriety could disqualify her from employment, leaving her few options beyond unstable labour or dangerous street work. Children, meanwhile, were judged as miniature representatives of their family's moral standing. A barefoot child could doom a mother's reputation. A child caught begging could mark a family as inherently disreputable. The tragedy is that this moral scrutiny allowed society to ignore systemic problems. If poverty was a character flaw, then there was no need to fix overcrowded housing, improve wages, or regulate dangerous workplaces. The Victorian moral lens turned social failures into personal sins, absolving the broader society of responsibility. Yet the poor were not passive victims of this system. They developed their own codes of respectability within their communities, standards of cleanliness, honesty, or mutual aid that reflected resilience rather than conformity. Working-class respectability often meant providing for family, maintaining dignity despite hardship, and navigating judgment with quiet strength. It was a different moral universe, built from necessity and solidarity rather than external expectation. Still, the upper and middle classes rarely recognized these forms of respectability. They preferred their own rigid, expensive and performative version, the one that required polished boots, time for silence, and a wardrobe of perfectly pressed clothing. The poor could rarely meet such requirements, and so they remained outside the circle of social approval, judged not for who they were but for what they lacked. Victorian society claimed respectability was earned, but for the poor it was withheld automatically. In this era, to be poor was not merely to struggle, it was to be judged, corrected, and perpetually deemed insufficient. Victorian workplaces were not simply places where labour was exchanged for wages. They were public arenas of moral display, where employees were expected to embody respectability as visibly and consistently as the furniture. Competence was important, yes, but competence alone could not guarantee employment. What employers really wanted was a worker who appeared disciplined, sober, tidy, restrained, and reliably proper at all times. It wasn't enough to do the job. You had to look like someone who lived a morally impeccable life, preferably one without hobbies, opinions, or signs of fatigue. In short, a Victorian employee had to appear less like a person and more like a walking emblem of societal values. The obsession with moral appearance began at the hiring stage. Employers evaluated candidates not by resumes, which didn't exist, but by reputation and presentation. A worker who arrived with polished shoes, clean clothing, and a composed face practically radiated employability. One who arrived rumpled, anxious, or visibly human risked rejection. References were not simply professional endorsements, they were character assessments. A prior employer could describe someone as hard-working, but if they added prone to laughter or somewhat spirited, the application might quietly migrate to the no pile. Once employed, workers faced constant scrutiny. In shops, offices, factories, and even household service, employers monitored behaviour in ways that today might require multiple legal departments. Appearance was policed relentlessly. A maid with a loose strand of hair risked reprimand. A clerk whose collar drooped in the heat could be called sloppy. A governess whose dress showed signs of wear might be judged as irresponsible, regardless of her skill. Even minor deviations from the expected visual script could provoke warnings, penalties, or outright dismissal. This fixation on visual morality stemmed from a widespread Victorian belief. How you looked revealed who you were. A messy appearance indicated messy habits. A tired expression suggested moral weakness. A loose posture might imply laziness or lack of discipline. Employers didn't want workers whose humanity leaked through the cracks. They wanted models of restraint and self-control, people who could perform respectability for hours on end while still producing endless labour. In customer-facing jobs, the pressure intensified. Shop assistants were expected to behave with calm, pleasant detachment. They must greet customers with measured cheer, never appearing flustered, annoyed, or fatigued. A single moment of visible frustration could reflect poorly on the establishment, which in Victorian language meant threaten the store's moral economy. The ideal employee was someone whose personality had been ironed out to match the crispness of their uniform. Factory workers faced a different but equally punishing version of moral expectation. Even in environments filled with noise, danger, and exhaustion, employers demanded punctuality, sobriety, and visible discipline. Workers who arrived looking too tired might be accused of irresponsibility. Those who laughed too loudly risked being labelled rowdy. Taking a moment to rest, however desperately needed, could invite comments about idleness. Productivity mattered, of course, but so did posture, tone, and the ability to maintain a morally approved demeanour while toiling beside machines that seemed intent on removing limbs. In domestic service, the performance of respectability became almost theatrical. Servants were expected to move quietly, speak minimally, and present themselves as models of cleanliness and composure. Their uniform signalled obedience and moral hygiene. A servant's appearance reflected directly on the household. If the maids looked sloppy, the family looked sloppy. If the footman appeared dishevelled, the master's dignity cracked. Servants lived under the constant pressure of being not just workers, but extensions of their employers' reputations. White-collar work was no gentler. Clerks, accountants, and office assistants were expected to perform gentlemanly restraint at all times. Any sign of emotional turbulence, anger, fear, excitement, or distress risked undermining their professional image. A respectable clerk maintained a quiet, orderly presence, blending into the background like wallpaper with good posture. Employers valued behaviour as much as skill. A man who produced excellent work but appeared disorganised, anxious, or socially unconventional could be dismissed simply because his presence disrupted the atmosphere of moral order. There were also gendered layers to this system. Women entering the workforce, whether as teachers, seamstresses, typists, or factory hands, faced additional expectations. Their appearance had to convey modesty. Their manner had to be soft but efficient. Their speech had to be polite but not overly familiar. A working woman who appeared too fashionable risked accusations of vanity. One who appeared too plain risked assumptions of slovenliness. A misjudged outfit could harm her prospects as severely as a professional mistake. Respectability in the workplace extended beyond appearance into behaviour after hours. Employers often investigated how workers spent their free time. A man seen at a pub too frequently might be dismissed for suspected intemperance. A woman observed walking alone at dusk could lose her job for questionable habits. Workers were expected to maintain reputability 24/7, as if employers held the lease on their personal lives. This intense moral surveillance created a peculiar contradiction. Victorian workplaces demanded emotional neutrality, while simultaneously demanding emotional symbolism. Workers had to look calm even when exhausted, optimistic even when underpaid, disciplined even when overwhelmed. Their faces became professional assets, their posture part of the job description. It didn't matter how competent they were if they couldn't maintain the performance. The cruel irony was that workplaces used respectability as a tool to justify harsh conditions. If an employee faltered under long hours or poor pay, employers attributed the problem to character rather than circumstance. It was easier and cheaper to insist workers improve themselves than to improve the workplace. In the Victorian world, being good at your job wasn't enough. You had to look good at your job unflappably, perpetually, and with no visible evidence of being a living, breathing human being. In short, one wrong wrinkle, one misplaced sigh, one moment of humanity, and you could find yourself unemployed. Stepping outside in Victorian society was not a casual act. It was a performance, an audition for respectability staged on streets, parks, shops, walkways, and drawing rooms. The moment someone left their front door, they were expected to follow a choreography of invisible rules so detailed that even standing still required strategy. Public behaviour wasn't merely observed, it was interpreted, judged, and catalogued as evidence of one's upbringing, character, and general fitness for society. To modernise, Victorian public life looks rigid. To Victorians, it looked orderly. But in practice, orderly meant everyone was silently terrified of doing something incorrectly. Walking was a moral activity. Walking in public was not just transportation, it was communication. Victorians believed one's walk reflected inner discipline. Steps had to be measured, posture upright, pace controlled. Too fast and you looked desperate or vulgar. Too slow and you looked idle or melancholic. Too confident and you looked arrogant. Too hesitant and you looked suspicious. Women were expected to glide, not march. Men were expected to stride, not saunter. Children, who naturally preferred sprinting, skipping, or bouncing, were told to compose themselves, a phrase that conveniently ignored the biological impossibility of composure in an 8-year-old. Even eye direction mattered. A respectable person did not stare, linger, or scan too widely. They looked ahead with polite purpose, as though on their way to somewhere important, regardless of whether they had anywhere to go. Speaking was a delicate art form. Public conversation required the finesse of embroidery. Voices had to be low, tones calm, and subjects safe. Emotional expression was discouraged. Passion was better suited for private letters written under a blanket. Women speaking too loudly were deemed improper. Men speaking too freely were considered undignified. One had to speak enough to appear sociable, but not so much that conversation attracted attention. Even laughter had limits. A polite chuckle was acceptable. Anything louder risked becoming social heresy, even if the joke absolutely deserved it. For this reason, many Victorians developed a soothing, almost uniform public voice, gentle, measured, and about as spontaneous as a well-trained metronome. Visiting was a ritual, not a casual stop. Social visits, calling on others, followed rules so intricate that they could fill an entire etiquette manual, and often did. You couldn't simply visit someone because you liked them. You visited if you'd been formally invited to do so, you were returning a previous visit, it was the correct day of the week, it was the proper hour, usually late afternoon. Your relationship was socially appropriate and you were dressed for the occasion. Even the length of a visit followed precise timing. Staying too long implied poor judgment. Leaving too soon implied indifference. A respectable visit often lasted 15 minutes, just long enough to demonstrate refinement, not long enough to reveal any real personality. Calling cards, a seemingly simple object, were essential tools for navigating this landscape. You left a card if someone wasn't home, if you wanted to initiate acquaintance, or if you wished to politely end a relationship without saying so directly. Mastering calling card etiquette was like learning a polite Victorian version of Morse code. Standing still required strategy. Loitering was morally suspicious. Standing too long in one place invited speculation. Were you waiting for someone inappropriate? Were you lost? Were you thinking? These were dangerous possibilities. Men standing idly risked looking unemployed or aimless. Women standing alone risked being misunderstood entirely. Children standing still were considered a miracle, though usually a sign that they were up to something. If one had to stop, say, to wait for a carriage, it had to be done with posture, dignity, and enough purposeful expression to reassure observers that one was not drifting toward moral decay. Etiquette extended into public spaces. Parks, promenades, restaurants, and theatres came with their own micro-rules. In parks, one walked the correct paths, nodded to acquaintances at the proper distances, and behaved as though the scenery had personally invited them to admire it. In restaurants, one avoided showing too much enjoyment of food. Eating with enthusiasm was practically indecent. In theatres, one clapped politely, laughed discreetly, and did not react too loudly, even during tragedies, romances, or scenes clearly written to provoke emotion. On public transportation, silence reigned. Talking loudly was frowned upon. Showing irritation was unacceptable. Asking strangers personal questions was an offence equivalent to theft. Even admiring shop windows required care. Too much interest suggested longing you couldn't afford. Too little suggested lack of aesthetic sense. The true purpose: moral surveillance. Victorian public behaviour rules were not arbitrary. They were tools of social regulation. A person who failed to perform respectability in public risked damaging their reputation, their employment prospects, their marriageability, and even their family standing. Everyone became everyone else's silent auditor. A misstep could travel through gossip networks faster than any messenger. A good impression, once made, needed constant renewal, like a subscription you never asked for. This public scripting created a world where spontaneity was suspicious, and normal human behaviour was quietly discouraged. People learned to behave in curated fragments: the correct walk, the acceptable tone, the proper visit, the respectable pause, the non-threatening amount of joy. It was exhausting, intricate, and wildly inefficient. But it was Victorian. Victorians didn't merely exist in public, they performed in public. And in a society where the rules were invisible, unverbalized, and relentlessly enforced, most people, despite their best efforts, got it wrong. In Victorian society, scandal did not merely bruise reputations, it obliterated them. A single rumour, whispered with just enough confidence, could unravel a career, dissolve a marriage prospect, alienate an entire circle of friends, and darken a family name for generations. The legal system might shrug, but society delivered its own verdict with ruthless efficiency. There were no appeals, no second chances, and no rehabilitation programs. Once marked by scandal, a person became a ghost in their own community, visible, but no longer socially alive. What made scandal so lethal was its speed and stickiness. In an age without mass communication, a damaging story still travelled with astonishing efficiency because gossip was the Victorian postal service, reliable, relentless, and delivered directly to those most eager to receive it. The moment suspicion attached itself to someone, people didn't ask whether the allegation was true. They asked what else might be true. Scandal, once ignited, grew like fire in a room full of velvet curtains. The origins of scandal varied. Sometimes it was a genuine moral misstep, an affair, an unpaid debt, an inappropriate friendship, or a poorly timed outburst. But just as often, it was the result of misinterpretation, a conversation overheard out of context, a chance meeting at dusk, a slightly unusual tone at a public event. In a culture trained to interpret every gesture as moral evidence, even innocent actions could bloom into social catastrophe. Most terrifying of all was how fragile the threshold was. Victorians didn't require proof, they required plausibility. If the rumour fit someone's perceived weaknesses or eccentricities, it took root instantly. A man known for being quiet might be accused of secret improprieties. A woman known for friendliness might suddenly be labelled too friendly. Respectability, once cracked, could not be glued back together. The social imagination was far stronger than any confession or denial. The destructive power of scandal came from its ability to erase opportunities. A professional man implicated in wrongdoing, real or imagined, might find clients disappearing, partners distancing themselves, and superiors quietly removing him from consideration for promotions. Employers rarely fired people explicitly for scandal. They simply regretted to inform you that circumstances no longer allowed for continued association. No explanation given, none needed. For women, scandal carried even sharper edges. A woman's reputation was considered so delicate that a mere breeze of suspicion could shatter it. Being seen alone with the wrong person, speaking too intimately, or even wearing clothing deemed slightly daring could ignite rumours. Once tainted, she might lose marriage prospects entirely. Friends withdrew, not out of cruelty but out of fear that her downfall might contaminate their own standing. In a society where women's futures depended heavily on their perceived virtue, scandal was nothing short of social exile. Families suffered collectively. A scandalized family faced sudden coldness from neighbours, fewer invitations and awkward silences during church gatherings. Parents might find their children denied friendships or school opportunities because another family feared the influence. Siblings could lose their own marriage prospects simply because sharing a last name now came with moral side effects. The Victorian community treated scandal like a contagion, and anyone connected to the infected party was urged, politely of course, to keep their distance. Even minor scandals had major consequences. A public argument could mark someone as unstable. A failed business venture hinted at dishonesty. A dispute over inheritance could label entire branches of a family as greedy. Financial troubles were particularly dangerous. Debt was seen not just as misfortune but as evidence of flawed character. A person in debt might avoid walking certain streets to escape judgmental glances. Simply being discussed became a penalty in itself. The tragic part was that scandal rarely ended with the truth. Even when accusations were proven false, the damage remained. Society had already made its assessment, and retractions rarely circulated as quickly as the original rumour. Victorians lacked the modern concept of moving on. Instead, disgrace became a kind of permanent footnote attached to a person's name. A few individuals fled to new towns or even new countries to escape their reputations. Others withdrew into isolation. Some embraced eccentricity as camouflage, but most simply lived with the shadow, hoping time would dull the memory, but not expecting it to disappear. Why was scandal so powerful? Because it threatened the delicate balance of Victorian social order. Respectability depended on shared beliefs about who could be trusted, admired, or emulated. A scandal disrupted those beliefs. It created uncertainty, tension, and the frightening realization that anyone could slip. To restore order, society had to isolate the source, even if it meant sacrificing someone who had done nothing wrong. Exclusion became a form of moral house cleaning. This didn't mean Victorians lacked sympathy. They often pitied the scandalized privately. But pity and association were very different things. Publicly supporting a disgraced individual required courage few possessed. To stand beside someone marked by scandal was to risk stepping into the blast radius. In this environment, people lived in quiet fear of making the wrong impression or being seen in the wrong place. They measured their words, moderated their actions, and selected their acquaintances with surgical precision. Everyone knew the rules were unfair. Everyone knew the punishment excessive. But the system persisted because no one dared challenge it, not when their own reputation hung by the thinnest of social threads. Victorians feared scandal not because it revealed who they were, but because it threatened everything they hoped to be. In a world where exclusion was more debilitating than prison, the worst sentence society could deliver was simple: you are no longer one of us. Victorian charity is often remembered through romanticised images: benevolent ladies handing out baskets of food, philanthropic gentlemen sponsoring schools, churches organising donations for the needy. But beneath this polished surface lay a system far more complicated and far more judgmental. Helping the poor was never simply about relieving suffering. It was about regulating behaviour, enforcing discipline, and ensuring that recipients mirrored the moral ideals of their benefactors. Charity was not a gift. It was an audition, and assistance was granted only to those who performed obedience convincingly. Victorian society, deeply shaped by the belief that poverty reflected personal deficiency, treated charity as a tool for moral correction. Before giving help, many philanthropists asked not, "What do you need?" but, "Do you deserve it?" This distinction created two categories of poor people: the deserving, mild, tidy, grateful, sober, and compliant, and the undeserving, who were noisy, proud, dishevelled, or simply unlucky enough to give off the wrong impression. The former received help. The latter received lectures. Charitable organisations often created elaborate applications to determine moral worthiness. Inspectors visited homes to evaluate cleanliness, orderliness, and character. They checked whether children were properly dressed, whether beds were made, whether the bread was stored neatly, and whether anyone looked suspiciously idle. A family could be denied assistance not because they lacked food, but because a single sock lay out of place. In the Victorian moral universe, untidiness was treated as a precursor to total moral collapse. Church-based charity, though well-intentioned, often reinforced these expectations. Before receiving support, families were required to attend services, memorize scripture, or submit to religious counselling. The poor were expected to prove their piety as well as their need. A starving family that missed Sunday service risked losing access to food. The message was clear: salvation and supper were intertwined, and both required proper behaviour. Even seemingly practical forms of charity came with strings. Soup kitchens expected recipients to behave quietly and reverently, as though receiving broth were a solemn sacrament. Clothing drives offered garments, but only those that matched respectable styles. No bright colours, no daring cuts, nothing that hinted at individuality. Some charities refused help altogether to people they suspected might spend money on anything other than pure necessity. A poor woman who bought a ribbon for her hair could be accused of extravagance. A man seen enjoying a pint after work might be judged too irresponsible to warrant support. This moral scrutiny was not limited to adults. Children, too, were judged through the harsh lens of Victorian charity. Schools for the poor accepted only those who appeared sufficiently submissive. Orphanages inspected children for signs of good character, a quality somehow expected from those who had lost everything. To qualify for educational charity, a child had to demonstrate eagerness, neatness, and silence, traits that revealed more about Victorian expectations than about childhood itself. The workhouse system took moral conditioning to an extreme. Entering a workhouse meant surrendering personal freedom and dignity. Families were separated, daily routines were rigid and intentionally demoralizing. Meals were plain to the point of punishment. These institutions were designed not just to shelter the destitute, but to discipline them. Poverty, in the Victorian mind, could be corrected through discomfort. Assistance was a last resort, and receiving it meant accepting total obedience to the institution's rules. Private philanthropists mirrored this logic. Many required poor women to attend lessons on housekeeping, sewing, childcare, and morality before receiving aid. Men seeking assistance were expected to demonstrate sobriety, punctuality, and unwavering diligence. If they faltered even slightly, support could be withdrawn. Charity wasn't just conditional, it was conditional on personal transformation as defined by the giver. What made Victorian charity particularly ruthless was that it often ignored structural causes of poverty, industrial layoffs, dangerous working conditions, low wages, overcrowded housing, and instead focused on personal discipline. If a man couldn't find work, charity groups questioned his industriousness. If a woman struggled to feed her children, her domestic management was scrutinized. The system assumed that poverty resulted from weakness of character rather than weakness of opportunity. Yet, paradoxically, Victorian society relied heavily on charity as a moral display. Wealthy families made public donations to demonstrate benevolence. Hosting charity events became a form of social prestige. Donors prided themselves on improving the lower classes, often without confronting the inequities that produced poverty in the first place. Charity soothed the conscience of the privileged, while disciplining the behaviour of the poor. Still, the poor were not passive recipients. They navigated this system with resourcefulness and intelligence. Some learned to perform respectability strategically, keeping rooms spotless before inspectors arrived, dressing children neatly even if it meant sacrificing other needs, offering polite phrases that signalled obedience even when they disagreed. Others relied on mutual aid networks within their communities, sharing resources informally to avoid the moral interrogation that institutional charity required. There were also reformers who challenged the conditional nature of Victorian charity. These individuals argued that poverty was not a moral failing, but a societal problem requiring systemic change. Their ideas planted seeds for future social reforms, but during most of the Victorian era, such perspectives remained in the minority. In the end, Victorian charity revealed more about the donors than the recipients. It exposed the era's deep anxieties about morality, order, and control. Assistance was never just assistance. It was an attempt to shape the poor into ideal versions of themselves, whether or not those ideals were realistic or humane. To receive help, one had to prove worthiness. To keep it, one had to behave perfectly. And if you failed the test, even once, charity withdrew, leaving you with nothing but the lesson that in Victorian society, obedience was the first step towards survival. Victorian leisure existed under the same scrutiny as everything else, measured, evaluated and carefully arranged so that pleasure never looked too much like pleasure. Enjoyment was permitted, but only if it wore the right clothing, modest, moral, educational and preferably indoors. Fun, in its raw and spontaneous form, was treated with deep suspicion. Anything that appeared frivolous or indulgent risked being labelled a threat to discipline. So Victorians did what Victorians always did. They domesticated fun, training it like a skittish animal until it behaved acceptably. The core belief shaping Victorian leisure was that every moment should contribute to self-improvement. Idleness was dangerous. It invited temptation, laziness, or, worst of all, visible enjoyment without justification. A respectable pastime had to signal refinement, intellectual growth, or bodily health. Activities that were too entertaining needed additional explanations to reassure observers that pleasure was merely a side effect, not the point. Reading, for instance, was acceptable, but not all reading. Improving books were ideal. Religious texts, moral tales, educational treatises, and biographies of exemplary figures. Fiction, especially the exciting or romantic sort, required caution. A person lost in a thrilling novel risked appearing overly emotional or dangerously imaginative. To enjoy fiction respectably, Victorians often emphasised its literary value, as if romance and adventure needed academic permission to be fun. Outdoor leisure faced similar scrutiny. Strolling through parks was respectable, so long as you walked at a measured pace and admired nature without displaying excessive enthusiasm. Gardens were for contemplation, not frolicking. Picnics were permissible if conducted with decorum, which meant carefully laid blankets, moderate conversation, and sandwiches cut into reasonable shapes. A picnic that produced too much laughter risked devolving into unruly joy, and unruly joy was one short step away from scandal. Sports were encouraged for men, but only if they signalled character development. Rowing demonstrated teamwork and endurance. Cricket cultivated patience and strategy. Hunting proved bravery and status. Even these activities had moral explanations attached to them, as if the running, sweating and exhilaration required official approval. Women's sports were permitted in gentler forms: croquet, lawn tennis, archery, activities that allowed physical engagement without threatening feminine decorum. A woman swinging too enthusiastically at a tennis ball risked looking unrefined. Respectable athleticism was delicate, measured, and performed in attire designed specifically to prevent too much freedom of movement. Music was another arena where pleasure needed justification. Playing piano was respectable because it showed cultural refinement and discipline. Singing was acceptable if done softly and modestly. Dancing, however, was scrutinized due to its dangerous proximity to joy. Ballroom dances were allowed but tightly choreographed, supervised, and executed with expressions suggesting mild concentration rather than actual delight. Anything more exuberant risked accusations of frivolity or impropriety. Social gatherings operated on similar principles. Parties were acceptable only when structured around predictable rituals. Calling hours, tea ceremonies, dinner arrangements, and card games conducted with serene politeness. Hosts had to ensure their events appeared orderly, improving, and dignified. Guests enjoyed themselves by following the script, admiring the decor, praising the modest entertainment, discussing weather or literature, and maintaining composure even when the urge to laugh bubbled dangerously close to the surface. Even children's leisure was managed with Victorian rigour. Playtime was allotted in careful segments, often supervised, and frequently infused with educational purpose. Toys that taught skills, puzzles, construction sets, moral storybooks were preferred over anything that generated noisy enthusiasm. The idea that children might play purely for joy was tolerated, but not celebrated. Childhood fun was considered a rehearsal for proper adult behaviour, which meant no silliness without supervision. Leisure also revealed class distinctions. The wealthy enjoyed country estates, private gardens, and refined amusements designed to showcase taste rather than indulgence. The middle class embraced activities like parlour games and reading circles, all of which reinforced the appearance of cultural engagement. The working class found recreation in pubs, music halls, street games, and community fairs. Activities often viewed skeptically by the upper classes because they contained too much spontaneity, laughter, or unstructured fun. Underlying all of this was a profound Victorian anxiety that pleasure, if left unchecked, might lead to moral collapse. Leisure was acceptable only when fenced in by rules, supervision, and respectability. A pastime needed to mean something beyond entertainment. Sewing circles cultivated domestic skill. Gardening encouraged patience. Listening to lectures improved the mind. Even collecting seashells was acceptable if one categorized them scientifically. The result was a peculiar balance. Victorians did enjoy themselves, sometimes immensely, but always behind the protective veil of moral purpose. They infused their amusements with language that disguised fun as virtue. A lively croquet match wasn't just a game, it was exercise. A theatre outing wasn't pleasure, it was cultural improvement. A seaside holiday wasn't a break. It was taking restorative air for one's health, and yet the joy still slipped through. Beneath the careful justifications, Victorians laughed, flirted, played, and found ways to save a life, even as they pretended otherwise. Fun persisted, quietly, politely, cautiously, but persistently. In Victorian society, enjoyment was never the scandal. Enjoying yourself without permission was. Victorian religion functioned as both spiritual guidance and an elaborate system of moral surveillance, merging personal faith with public scrutiny so thoroughly that the two became almost indistinguishable. At a time when respectability governed every aspect of daily life, religion provided the script, the soundtrack, and the audience. It was not merely something Victorians believed, it was something they were expected to perform, consistently and visibly, as proof of their moral worth. The century's dominant religious culture, especially within Protestant communities, preached discipline, restraint, self-improvement, and the rejection of worldly indulgence. But Victorian faith was not a private communion of conscience. It was a public demonstration of uprightness, measured by how faithfully one attended services, how earnestly one recited prayers, and how convincingly one appeared to embody virtue. Religion and respectability were so intertwined that a person's faith life became a diagnostic tool for evaluating their character. Attending church, for example, was far more than participation in worship. It was a visual declaration of moral health. The respectable went to church, regularly, predictably, and dressed in their finest. Families filed into pews like solemn processions, aware that their punctuality, posture, and attentiveness communicated as much about their virtue as any hymn sung. Being absent raised questions. Being consistently absent raised eyebrows. If someone missed too many Sundays without a dramatic illness or travel alibi, their reputation began to collect dust in the corners of parish gossip. Sermons reinforced the expectations. Preachers spoke fervently about self-discipline, temperance, humility, and moral vigilance. Congregations listened with a mixture of fear and pride, fear that they might fall short, and pride that they were at least trying harder than the family in the next pew. Some sermons focused on charity, others on purity, others on obedience. But always, beneath the theology, was the message that moral behavior was a public responsibility. God judged hearts, but communities judged everything else. Religious rituals also played a crucial role in shaping behavior. Baptisms, confirmations, weddings, and funerals carried enormous moral weight. These ceremonies weren't simply spiritual milestones, they were public affirmations of belonging. A well-performed ceremony bolstered the family's respectability. A poorly executed one, for example, an unplanned pregnancy overshadowing a wedding, could stain the family for years. The religious calendar subtly managed social expectations. Lent provided a seasonal reminder of restraint, while Christmas invited displays of generosity and family harmony. But the true engine of Victorian religious respectability was moral surveillance disguised as piety. Church communities kept careful watch over one another, often out of genuine concern, but also out of a societal habit of equating observation with virtue. A neighbour who heard raised voices might mention it to the minister. A woman seen returning home late might be the subject of a prayer request that sounded suspiciously like a report. The lines between spiritual accountability and communal policing blurred until no one could tell them apart. This scrutiny extended into charitable organisations, many of which were explicitly religious. The poor who sought aid were required to demonstrate piety, attending services, participating in Bible studies, or adopting certain moral habits before receiving support. The wealthy donors believed they were improving souls. The recipients understood they were being evaluated. Faith became a passcode, and respectability the price of entry. For the middle class, maintaining religious respectability meant following unwritten rules of spiritual conduct. One did not boast about wealth, but one could display generosity conspicuously. One did not confess doubt openly, but one could engage in gently skeptical conversation if it was framed as intellectual inquiry rather than spiritual unrest. Families displayed Bibles prominently, often unread but perfectly dusted. Homes featured religious art, not necessarily for devotion, but for decorum. Women, in particular, were expected to act as religious role models within the home. Their piety was seen as essential to maintaining domestic stability. A woman leading her children in prayers was praised. A woman expressing theological opinions too boldly was warned about stepping into roles reserved for men. Religious devotion became yet another arena where women were required to exhibit moral perfection, while carefully avoiding the impression of authority. Men's religious respectability took a different form. They were expected to support the church financially, attend regularly, and exhibit stoic moral leadership. Displays of emotional fervour, however, were considered suspect, too expressive, too vulnerable, too unrestrained. Men performed religious duty the way they performed all respectable duties, quietly, consistently, and with an expression suggesting they were serenely above earthly temptation, even if they were just thinking about overdue bills. Despite all this structure, Victorians were not insincere in their faith. Many were deeply devout, but the culture made it difficult to separate genuine belief from the performance of belief. People prayed fervently at home and then projected serene confidence in public. They struggled privately with doubt, but feared admitting it might make them appear unstable or improperly guided. The spiritual and social were woven so tightly together that pulling one strand often tugged at the other. The immense pressure to appear morally upright created its own set of paradoxes. Some people became experts at ethical camouflage, behaving impeccably in public while living complicated private lives. Others grew rigid, terrified of transgression. A few rebelled quietly, attending church out of obligation, while nurturing hidden pockets of secular joy. And still others devoted themselves sincerely to faith, managing to find meaning in a system that sometimes confused moral sincerity with moral theatre. In the Victorian world, religion was both compass and spotlight, showing people the way while illuminating every misstep. Faith guided the soul, but respectability guided the body. God watched from above. Everyone else watched from across the street. To a Victorian, the concept of privacy as we understand it today, personal boundaries, confidential conversations, closed doors with guaranteed solitude, would have sounded suspiciously like secrecy. And secrecy, in a society fueled by reputation, looked a lot like wrongdoing. In the Victorian world, privacy was not a right. It was barely even a possibility. Lives intertwined physically, socially, and morally. Walls were thin, houses crowded, communities tightly knit, and social norms relentless in their insistence that individuals remain visible, knowable, and politely exposed. Your business belonged to the community because the community believed it had the right and responsibility to interpret it. Victorian homes themselves resisted privacy. Working-class families often lived in cramped quarters where multiple children, parents, boarders, and sometimes animals shared the same space. Secrets were impossible when 6 people slept in one room, and everyone heard everyone else breathing. Even middle-class homes, larger and more elaborately arranged, were full of servants, quiet observers who drifted through hallways, overheard conversations, and carried domestic information strategically between households. Living with servants meant that nothing remained entirely personal. A misplaced letter, an emotional outburst, a late-night argument, someone always noticed. But even without servants or cramped housing, the Victorian community structure ensured that privacy dissolved into public interest. Neighbours observed each other as a matter of duty. Windows were watched, routines noted, visitors identified. A slight change, someone leaving the house at an odd hour, curtains drawn too long, a child crying unusually loudly, could trigger rounds of hushed analysis. People considered it responsible to monitor each other, as if maintaining moral order required collective vigilance. If you attempted to keep something to yourself, someone certainly noticed and wanted to know why. Conversations rarely stayed between their original participants. News, questions, and speculations travelled quickly through social networks. Church groups, market vendors, post office lines, washing yards, boarding house corridors. What someone said in confidence to one person could be politely dissected by 20 more by evening. Letters, theoretically private, were sometimes read aloud in families or selectively shared with friends. Mail carriers, laundresses, clerks, and tailors all handled tiny fragments of other people's lives, and each fragment risked becoming public currency. Privacy was also challenged by deeply embedded social norms. Victorians believed society improved when everyone's conduct was visible and accountable. People felt entitled to weigh in on each other's habits, parenting, decisions, and even emotional states. A mother might be advised, unsolicited, about how often her children should be outdoors. A man could be judged for reading too much or too little. A married couple might find their relationship assessed by neighbours, observing the frequency of their walks together. To withdraw from communal observation was to invite suspicion. Even romantic relationships unfolded under heavy surveillance. Courtship rituals practically ensured the absence of solitude. Couples were expected to engage under the watchful eyes of chaperones, relatives, or entire drawing rooms of people pretending not to stare. A moment alone, however innocent, could spark rumours that altered marriage prospects instantly. Society was determined to keep love safe by eliminating the possibility of privacy altogether. Privacy in communication was equally scarce. Telegraph operators read every message they transmitted. Postmasters sometimes knew the contents of letters before their intended recipients. Boarding house landlords overheard conversations through walls thinner than paper. Even diaries were at risk of being discovered and circulated, particularly if someone died suddenly, at which point personal writings became communal property, often read by relatives searching for moral reassurance or scandalous revelations. The absence of privacy extended to public spaces. Simple actions, walking, sitting, entering a shop, were observed and interpreted. A woman seen speaking to a stranger might provoke whispers about impropriety. A man stopping at a pub twice in a week might be suspected of developing a vice. Even posture and facial expressions became objects of communal commentary. People didn't merely exist in public, they existed under review. Victorian workplaces also eroded privacy. Employers monitored workers both on and off the job, sometimes questioning neighbours about employees' habits. Boarding employers for domestic servants often knew exactly when their staff slept, ate, or stepped outside. Mistakes made during leisure hours, public disagreements, lateness, overly cheerful interactions could cost someone their job since personal conduct was considered a professional qualification. One might assume the wealthy enjoyed more privacy, but upper-class households were bustling ecosystems of constant human presence. Servants moved silently through hallways. Guests arrived unannounced. Gossip about aristocratic families circulated in newspapers and drawing rooms alike. Privacy was a rare and carefully negotiated commodity, even in mansions with 20 rooms. Wealthier Victorians had more space, but not necessarily more solitude. What makes Victorian privacy so different from the modern idea is the cultural assumption that individuals didn't own their personal information. Communities viewed a person's life as a shared narrative, something everyone contributed to and interpreted. Asking questions, offering unsolicited advice, gossiping, watching. It all felt natural, necessary, even protective. Society believed itself responsible for ensuring everyone behaved according to moral expectations. And to enforce morality, you had to know everything. Yet despite this intrusive culture, Victorians valued modesty. They did not openly discuss bodily functions, intimate relationships, financial struggles, or emotional turmoil. These topics were taboo precisely because everyone already knew too much about everyone else. Silence protected dignity in a world where privacy could not. In the Victorian world, privacy wasn't a boundary. It was a luxury, and often an illusion. Your life was a community project. Your choices were public interest, and your business, no matter how small, was everyone's business. Victorian society prized virtue so intensely and punished deviation so severely that many people learned to survive by developing two selves, one for public consumption and one for private reality. Outwardly, they projected calmness, restraint, and spotless morality. Inwardly, they navigated desires, frustrations, and contradictions that the official script of respectability simply couldn't accommodate. Double lives weren't rare or scandalous. They were normal, almost expected. Respectability didn't merely encourage hypocrisy, it refined it into an art form. The first version of Victorian duplicity emerged from the relentless pressure to appear impeccable. Public virtue required constant maintenance, curated clothing, careful posture, polite speech, and an unwavering emotional façade. But no human being can sustain that level of performance indefinitely. People needed outlets, spaces where they could drop the act, loosen their moral corsets, and breathe like actual humans. The result was a quiet but pervasive culture of private contradictions. Take emotions, for instance. In public, Victorians practiced a disciplined calm. They rationed joy, contained grief, and muted anger. But behind closed doors, people argued passionately, laughed loudly, collapsed into tears, or confessed fears to diaries and trusted companions. Homes, especially the inner room shielded from visitors, were sanctuaries where masks slipped and true feelings surfaced. A woman who smiled serenely during afternoon tea might weep privately over unspoken frustrations. A man who projected stoic authority at work might collapse into exhausted vulnerability at home. Respectability required a polished facade. Reality required release. Romantic and social relationships also generated double lives. Courtship unfolded under strict surveillance, so couples often found subtle ways to communicate genuine affection without violating decorum. A glance lasted slightly too long. A hand brushed accidentally. A letter was slipped quietly into a book. Respectability demanded that love appear restrained. Real affection found creative ways to flourish beneath the surface. Marriage, too, could contain layers unseen by outsiders. A couple who appeared perfectly harmonious at church might struggle privately with disagreements or emotional distance. Conversely, a couple mocked for awkwardness in public might share genuine tenderness behind closed doors. Victorian culture curated marriage as a moral performance, leaving the private complexities conveniently out of sight. The most dramatic examples of double lives emerged around topics Victorian society refused to discuss openly: sexuality, desires, addictions, and personal flaws. Because public morality condemned these human experiences, people managed them discreetly. A businessman celebrated for his sobriety might secretly rely on alcohol to manage stress. A woman praised for modesty might confide romantic fantasies only in her diary. The brothels, gambling houses, and clandestine meeting spots that dotted Victorian cities didn't exist in spite of respectability. They existed because of it. Every strict public rule created a private loophole. Men, particularly, navigated two moral scripts: the respectable gentleman and the private individual with complex habits. They were expected to be paragons of discipline and rationality, yet many frequented clubs or establishments that offered escape from those expectations. Women, bound by even stricter rules, often developed subtler double lives. They shared confessions in letters to trusted friends, kept hidden stashes of sentimental objects, or pursued intellectual passions privately to avoid appearing unfeminine. Servants witnessed these dualities firsthand. They moved silently through households, observing missteps, whispered arguments, hidden affections, and private rituals. Many households operated on an unspoken agreement. Servants kept quiet about what they saw, and employers pretended complete control. This tacit arrangement helped preserve the illusion of public perfection, while acknowledging the manageable chaos beneath it. Double lives also emerged in the professional sphere. A clerk who seemed the picture of diligence might dream of writing novels. A governess who appeared modest and reserved might express bold opinions in personal letters. Teachers, shopkeepers, and tradesmen often performed respectable roles while harbouring private passions or doubts. Because Victorian society valued conformity, individuality flourished discreetly, tucked into journals, poems, or after-hours hobbies. Religious expectations added another layer. Public piety was essential for respectability, but private faith varied wildly. Some people doubted silently, afraid to voice their questions. Others believed deeply, but disliked religious theatrics. Still others attended church faithfully, while living in ways the sermons forbade. Spiritual double lives weren't necessarily acts of deception. They were often acts of survival, reconciling personal beliefs with communal pressure. Importantly, not all double lives were morally charged. Some were simply strategic. A young woman might pretend disinterest in marriage to fend off unwelcome suitors, while privately longing for companionship. A man hoping for promotion might hide his intellectual pursuits to appear practical. People learned to tailor their public image to meet expectations, an adaptive skill in a society that equated slight missteps with disgrace. But double lives came with emotional costs. Maintaining two versions of oneself required constant vigilance. A single slip, a too loud laugh, a misplaced letter, an unexpected visitor at the wrong moment could expose contradictions and invite judgment. Many Victorians lived with the low-grade fear of being found out, not for committing crimes, but simply for being imperfectly human. And yet, the system persisted because everyone participated in it. Everyone had something they hid. Everyone understood the pressures. Respectability was a shared delusion that created its own rules, loopholes, and risks. Double lives thrived not because Victorians were uniquely deceptive, but because their culture demanded an impossible level of perfection. In the Victorian world, authenticity was a private luxury. Publicly, one performed virtue with careful precision. Privately, one lived, messy, passionate, flawed, and real. Respectability didn't eliminate contradictions. It simply taught people how to disguise them beautifully. Victorian respectability looked, on the surface, like a well-oiled machine powered by piety, discipline, etiquette, and shared moral values. But beneath the polished exterior, the true fuel keeping everything running smoothly was something far more primal. Fear. Fear of judgment. Fear of exclusion. Fear of missteps. Fear of scandal. Fear of being noticed for the wrong reasons or, just as dangerous, not noticed at all. Victorians didn't maintain their elaborate system of social correctness out of pure conviction. They maintained it because stepping outside the lines felt like stepping off a cliff. This wasn't fear in the dramatic sense. No mobs with torches, no official punishments handed down by stern councilmen. It was softer, subtler, and far more effective. It lived in the pauses of conversation, in the sideways glances of neighbours, in the quick closing of curtains when someone walked by. Victorians carried fear the way people carry umbrellas, not always open, but always within reach. The first and most universal fear was fear of being talked about. Gossip acted as the smoke signal of Victorian moral life. It could travel anywhere, touch anyone, and cling stubbornly even after the original spark died out. A whispered comment in a drawing room might echo for months across church pews, workplaces, and market stalls. People didn't need the fear of divine punishment to behave. They needed only the fear of Mrs. Abernathy from next door raising a sceptical eyebrow. In a society where reputation shaped every opportunity, even a hint of negative commentary could throw someone into spirals of panic. This constant vigilance transformed ordinary life into a quiet performance, every gesture rehearsed to avoid setting tongues wagging. Victorians also feared misalignment, behaving in ways that didn't match their perceived station. The rules of respectability were so specific and so widely known that breaking them unintentionally felt like a nightmare. Walk too quickly, laugh too loudly, express too honest an opinion, and suddenly you risk standing out in ways that invited scrutiny. The social code was invisible but omnipresent, and no one wanted to be the unfortunate soul who violated a rule no one would explain yet everyone enforced. This fear of accidental misbehaviour kept people on high alert, a perpetual state of polite anxiety. Fear also shaped ambitions. Victorian individuals weighed every choice, jobs, marriage, friendships, moves, with the question, will this make me look respectable? A promising opportunity could be rejected simply because it looked suspicious. A romantic interest could be avoided because their family raised eyebrows. Entire lives were built around avoiding activities that might produce even momentary appearances of impropriety. Ironically, this meant many people's futures were dictated not by their desires, but by their fear of how those desires would be interpreted. Fear of exclusion created additional pressure. In Victorian society, one's social circle was both safety net and identity. To be excluded was not just inconvenient, it was psychologically devastating. It meant fewer marriage prospects, fewer work opportunities, fewer allies. People longed for acceptance, but acceptance came with rigid conditions. This fear drove conformity so strong that even those who disliked the system found themselves participating in it. Better to stay inside a restrictive circle than to risk standing outside alone. Another layer of fear stemmed from economic fragility. Even middle-class households lived under constant threat of financial instability. A failed business, a lost job, an unexpected expense, any of these could topple a family into precarious standing. Respectability became a lifeline, something that might safeguard opportunities if fortune faltered. The anxiety of economic uncertainty made people cling fiercely to the social rules that promised a semblance of security. Fear didn't just shape morals, it shaped budgets, schedules, wardrobes, and entire daily routines. Victorians also feared unpredictability itself. The rapid changes of the era, industrialization, urbanization, scientific advancement, created a world that felt restless and shifting. Respectability offered stability, a structure that reassured people even when everything else seemed in motion. And so, fear attached itself to the idea of change. New fashions, new ideas, new behaviours were greeted with suspicion because they threatened the delicate equilibrium fear had created. Holding on to old rules felt safer than exploring new freedoms. Perhaps the most poignant fear was fear of being truly known. When public virtue was paramount, authenticity became risky. Revealing one's real opinions, desires, weaknesses, or ambitions could lead to misunderstanding or judgment. Many Victorians hid enormous parts of themselves, not out of shame, but out of self-preservation. Better to present a curated version of the self than to expose the vulnerable whole. Fear, in this sense, protected people from social harm, even as it deprived them of deeper connection. Yet fear wasn't always destructive. It also regulated the social system in ways that Victorians believed were beneficial. Fear encouraged politeness, punctuality, and moderation. It reduced blatant conflict. It maintained predictable behavior in public spaces. People felt safer when others followed the rules, even if the rules themselves were suffocating. Fear, paradoxically, created a sense of comfort by limiting chaos. But the system had cracks. Fear could become overwhelming, leading to isolation, stress, or emotional exhaustion. The very structure meant to protect reputations often crushed individuality. Some adapted by perfecting their social roles. Others rebelled quietly, embracing small acts of disobedience. Many simply endured, navigating the labyrinth of expectations with a mix of resignation and skill. For all its elegance, Victorian respectability was fragile, held together not by universal agreement but by universal apprehension. In the end, fear did what rules and sermons could not. It governed behaviour more effectively than any authority figure. Victorians didn't follow the script because they believed every line. They followed it because forgetting a line, even once, might cost them everything. By the late Victorian era, the great edifice of respectability, built from polished manners, ironed clothing, rigid posture, and a truly astonishing amount of anxiety, began to show fractures. These cracks didn't appear all at once, nor did they destroy the system immediately. Instead, they spread slowly, subtly, as industrial change, scientific discovery, and evolving social values chipped away at the foundations. Respectability didn't collapse spectacularly. It simply began to look increasingly out of step with reality, like a proud old building still insisting it's structurally sound while the wallpaper peels off in long accusatory strips. One of the most powerful forces stressing the Victorian moral framework was industrialisation. Factories multiplied, cities ballooned, railways carved through the countryside, and population shifted at a pace no etiquette manual could keep up with. The old idea that one's social value could be measured by appearance, tone, and posture suddenly felt inadequate in a world where success depended more on navigating machinery, commerce, and sheer urban chaos. Workers who spent 12 hours in mills did not emerge at the end of the day looking immaculate, and yet their labour powered the nation. This contradiction weakened the belief that neatness reflected moral worth. People began to see, sometimes reluctantly, that respectability's visual criteria simply didn't match the practical demands of modern life. Scientific development added another blow. The rise of evolutionary theory, led by thinkers like Charles Darwin, challenged the notion that humans were tidy, divinely ordered creatures capable of perfect self-control. Victorians confronted unsettling ideas about natural instincts, inherited traits, and the chaotic forces shaping life. These theories didn't eliminate religion, but they nudged society toward questioning simplistic moral formulas. If human nature was more complex than a well-fitted waistcoat, perhaps the rigid rules of behaviour weren't divinely mandated after all. Respectability, once viewed as a universal moral truth, began to seem like a cultural costume rather than a fundamental virtue. Meanwhile, psychological insights, still embryonic but growing, threatened the Victorian fantasy of emotional discipline. Early studies of the mind suggested people weren't calm machines choosing rational behaviour at all times. They were bundles of impulses, memories, pressures, and desires. The idea that emotions could be controlled through posture and politeness began to feel optimistic at best, delusional at worst. If humans naturally carried contradictions within them, maybe the moral façade adults had built since childhood wasn't sustainable. urban life also shifted social dynamics. In booming cities like London, anonymity grew. People could walk through crowded streets and encounter hundreds of strangers who neither knew nor cared about their reputations. This created a freedom impossible in small, tightly knit communities where gossip functioned like oxygen. With anonymity came experimentation, new fashions, new behaviours, new identities. Respectability's ever-watchful eye lost some of its power when it couldn't keep track of everyone. Cultural shifts accelerated the unravelling. Art and literature grew bolder, poking fun at the pretensions of polite society. Satirists mocked stiff manners. Novelists explored the messy contradictions behind perfect façades. Playwrights exposed the absurdity of moral hypocrisy. Oscar Wilde, in particular, delighted in skewering respectability's hollow middle, showing how its rules could crumble under the slightest pressure. People laughed at these portrayals because they recognized the truth in them. Respectability contained so many contradictions that even those who upheld it sometimes found its demands comically exhausting. The role of women also shifted dramatically. Increased access to education, broader social participation, and the slow but persistent movement toward women's rights challenged the belief that femininity required stillness, modesty, and moral symbolism. Women began advocating for independence, speaking publicly, working outside the home, and rejecting the idea that they should bear the entire burden of a family's respectability. Their changing roles revealed how arbitrary many of the old rules truly were. If a woman could study medicine, campaign for suffrage, or write publicly about controversial ideas, why on earth couldn't she laugh loudly or walk alone? The working classes, too, reshaped the landscape. As labour movements grew, workers demanded not only better pay but dignity and representation. They rejected the notion that poverty signified moral failure, insisting instead that the system, not their character, determined their circumstances. This shift reframed respectability's harsh assumptions about the poor, forcing middle-class Victorians to reconsider long-held prejudices. Even technology mocked the old order. Photography captured real life in ways portrait painters never had. Rail travel forced strangers to sit inches from each other, breaking down the spatial rituals of politeness. Telephones introduced new, awkward forms of conversation that etiquette struggled to regulate. Modernity kept inventing situations the old rulebook had never anticipated, and Victorians scrambled to adapt. By the late 19th century, respectability still existed. It hadn't vanished. But it sagged under the weight of contradictions. People still performed it, but increasingly with a kind of tired awareness that the performance was dated. Young people embraced new freedoms. Middle-aged citizens muttered about how society is changing. Elders insisted the old ways still mattered, even as they privately found them harder to defend. The façade was intact, but the paint was cracking. The rules still stood, but people began noticing how absurd some of them looked. Respectability had not been overthrown. It had simply become unconvincing. In the end, Victorian respectability didn't shatter. It faded, like wallpaper too long exposed to sunlight. People didn't stop following the rules overnight. They just stopped believing the rules defined who they were. Victorian respectability left behind an unforgettable paradox. It worked, and it hurt. It created one of the most stable, disciplined, and outwardly harmonious societies in modern history. And it did so by applying pressure so constant, so intimate, and so exhaustive that the people living beneath it sometimes felt as if they were being pressed into elegant, upright statues. Respectability made sense in its own time. The world was changing rapidly, cities were swelling, and social hierarchies were wobbling. Order felt necessary, predictability felt safe, but the very system designed to keep society steady often kept individuals suffocating quietly inside their own lives. The good news was that respectability united people around shared expectations. In a world without widespread policing, digital surveillance, or social services, The moral code served as an informal contract. Everyone knew the script. They knew how to dress, how to speak, how to behave in public, how to avoid scandal, how to protect their families' reputations. The rules reduced uncertainty. They gave structure to chaotic urban growth and bound strangers into recognizable social patterns. You could walk into a shop, a church, or a railway station and predict almost exactly how people would behave. Predictability created trust. The whole system operated like a giant social machine, humming politely along. Respectability also gave people goals. It offered a clear path to acceptance, or at least the illusion of one. Work hard, dress properly, maintain composure, avoid gossip, respect hierarchy, keep your home tidy, show restraint, attend church, choose good company. It wasn't an easy formula, but it was a formula. For those with enough resources to follow it, the path to stability was legible in a way much of life was not. Respectability was a ladder built out of self-discipline. But beneath these reassuring structures lay the bad news, the emotional bill that everyone quietly paid. Respectability demanded constant self-surveillance, a never-ending awareness of how one might be seen, interpreted, or judged. Every moment became a performance, and the audience was everywhere. Strangers on the street, neighbours leaning out of windows, co-workers sharing whispers, churchgoers evaluating posture and piety, all served as an invisible jury. No one could fully relax into their own humanity without risking misinterpretation. It wasn't merely exhausting, it was constricting. Respectability stifled spontaneity, humour, creativity, emotional openness, and authentic expression. It made people cautious about laughter, wary of tears, suspicious of pleasure, and deeply practiced in the art of concealment. Private desires were hidden, private weaknesses denied, private joys rationed. Ordinary lives were filled with quiet compromises, concealed sadness, unspoken longings, rehearsed smiles. Respectability made people careful, so careful that many forgot what unguarded living felt like. It also reinforced inequalities. The wealthy had easier access to respectability because they had the clothing, the space, the time, and the insulation from hardship that allowed them to perform it convincingly. The poor, meanwhile, were judged for failing to uphold standards they never had the means to meet. Respectability became not only a behavioural code but a class filter. It looked moral, but it behaved political. And perhaps most painfully of all, respectability created emotional distance. If you could never show too much joy, too much sorrow, too much opinion, too much anything, relationships remained shallow more often than deep. Friendships operated behind polite masks. Courtship rituals prevented genuine intimacy from developing before marriage. Families hid conflicts behind closed doors, then hid the closed doors behind silence. The system maintained order, yes, but it often did so by limiting the full range of human connection. Yet, despite all these restrictions, Victorians weren't simply victims of their own system. They navigated it, adapted to it, bent it, and sometimes even gently rebelled against it. People carved out private sanctuaries, moments with friends, journals filled with confessions, hobbies pursued quietly at night, whispered loves, shared secrets. They found ways to be themselves despite the pressure to be perfect. Respectability demanded suffocating restraint, but humans are remarkably good at creating oxygen when none seems available. By the end of the Victorian era, the system cracked because its contradictions became impossible to ignore. Industrialization challenged class structures. Science challenged old certainties. The expanding world challenged narrow moral scripts. People saw that the rules weren't eternal truths. They were coping mechanisms. They had served their purpose, but they no longer fit the world people actually lived in. And so respectability faded. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, like fog dissolving in sunlight. Some of its values lingered: courtesy, discipline, cleanliness, self-control. But the suffocating rigidity loosened, privacy expanded, emotional expression widened. Individuality began its slow, uneven rise. Looking back, Victorian respectability reveals a society desperate for order, but hungry for freedom. It teaches us how powerful social expectations can be, how deeply they shape behaviour, and how easily they can mask internal realities. It also leaves us with the era's ultimate punchline: the good news, society stayed orderly. The bad news, nobody could breathe.